Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The wind out howled like a restless spirit, rattling the shutters of the little cabin where the old cowboy sat by the fire, his boots crossed at the ankles, hat tipped forward just enough to shadow his tired eyes. He spoke in a slow, steady drawl, the kind of voice shaped by years of dust, grit, and long trails. "Now, son," he said, leaning forward to poke at the logs, "wealth don't always come from the gold folks chase, nor the cattle they count under the hot sun. No, real fortune often starts when a man's mind learns patience, when he lets his mistakes simmer into lessons, and his dreams stay stubborn enough to keep walking beside him." He remembered a time when his pockets were so empty the only thing jingling inside them was hope. He had ridden into a town that was near abandoned, a place where paint peeled from the saloon doors and dust had claimed every boardwalk. To most folks it looked like a graveyard of ambition, but he had eyes that looked beyond what was gone and searched instead for what could be reborn. He saw that broken town as a ledger not yet written, a count just waiting for someone to balance it right. The first step wasn't money, it was sweat. He traded his labor for meals, patched up fences, helped the widow mend her roof, swept out the forgotten general store. Folks began to notice. Trust, he said, was worth more than coin at the start. A man word, he muttered, a currency folks spend long before their pockets fill. Break it and you'll find yourself poorer than any beggar. Bit by bit, the town leaned on him. In their reliance, he saw the foundation for his wealth. When the storekeeper passed on, leaving behind shelves of dust and debt, the cowboy saw his chance. Instead of buying outright, he offered to manage the store for a share of the profit. It was risky, sure, but it was also smart. No heavy burden of debt, just a fair shake at turning work into work. He stocked it with goods brought from traders he befriended along the trail, striking deals where others only saw dead ends. One crate of flour became two became four, and before long, the townsfolk weren't riding days away for supplies, they were coming to him. The rain drummed harder on the roof as his story unwound. He spoke of nights spent sleeping in that cold storeroom, with burlap sacks for pillows, and of mornings he rose before dawn to tally goods and set fair prices. Wealth, he explained, grows from discipline the way crops grow from water soil. He refused to cheat his neighbors. Instead, he gave them value and earned loyalty. Loyalty, in turn, made him rich. Remember that he said softly, tapping the arm of his chair for emphasis, riches without trust are like a horse without reins, fast to run, but bound for a crash. But even success comes with storms. Rivals rode in, slick with silver tongues, promising cheaper goods and brighter futures. Folks were tempted, those strayed, but the cowboy stood steady. He didn't drop his prices to ruin himself. He offered what the others couldn't, honesty and consistency. He told his customers straight, if you want promises that vanish as smoke, go on and buy elsewhere. But if you want a store that'll stand when the dust settles, you'll find me here tomorrow, same as today. Over time, the rivals' tricks collapsed, their goods spoiled, their credit dried up. The cowboy endured, and endurance, he reminded, is a man's greatest ally in building fortune. As the flames crackled, he leaned back and sighed. Now I ain't saying it was easy. I worked through fevers, through nights when wolves howled close and I wondered if the whole dream would cave in. But each day I planted, just a little more than I reaped, each coin I earned to let grow instead of squandering. And slowly, that trickle of coins became a stream, and that stream turned into a river. He paused, his gaze lost in the glow of the fire. See, son, wealth is quiet at first. It don't announce itself with trumpets. It whispers in the corners of your effort, and only when you've given it years of your life does it finally speak loud. The lesson rolled off, tip-map smoke rising from the campfire. Wealth was not built on miracles nor luck, but on vision, integrity, and grit stretched thin until it hardened into character. You can chase gold till your boots wear thin, he said, voice low. But if you don't chase the man you're meant to be while gathering it, you'll find your fortune feels mighty hollow. The rain outside eased to a patter, though the world itself was leaning close to listen. The cowboy closed his eyes, rocking gently in his chair, letting the weight of his words sink deep into the silence. He shifted in his chair, the old boards creaking under him, and the firelight flickered across his weather-beater face like a lantern on canyon walls. His voice carried on, unhurried, the kind of tone that knew the listener had nowhere better to be than right there, soaking in the wisdom of a life hard lived. "Now don't mistake me," he said. "There's a mighty temptation to grab at every shiny coin the minute it hits your hand. Folks will tell you money burns heads in pockets, and for most it surely does. But I learned early that wealth ain't about how fast you spend. It's about how long you can hold." He told of how he started saving scraps of profit, stashing away coins in a strongbox beneath a false floorboard. Each clink of metal was like a brick laid in the foundation of a future no one else could see. At first the pile seemed pitiful, hardly enough to buy more than a few nails or a sack of beans. But discipline turned that trickle into a tide. It's like watching a sapling grow, he explained.
At first you doubt it'll amount to shade or fruit, but give it care, patience, and time, and one day you'll look up to find it towering over you. The cowboy recalled neighbors who laughed at him for living so lean. They'd ride into town dressed sharp, buying whiskey and trinkets to show off their success. Nights were loud in the saloon, coins traded for fleeting moments of laughter, but he kept to his cabin, eating stew by the fire and polishing his accounts ledger instead. "I wasn't poorer than them," he said with a chuckle. "I was just richer in tomorrow." In time, those same neighbors came knocking, hats in hand, asking for loans when their spending left them dry. He never gloated, never mocked. He lent fair, with terms honest but firm, and when they paid him back, his river of wealth grew wider. But fortune wasn't just about coins.
Build relationships with a craftsman builds a saddle tight, sturdy and made to last through rough rides. He partnered with ranchers, trading fair for beef and hides. He struck deals with traveling merchants, making sure their goods reached town safe from bandits, and every deal was sealed not with signatures on paper, but with a steady handshake and eyes that never flinched. Trust became the mortar that held his growing wealth together. "Money without trust," he said softly, "is like water without a bucket. It'll slip through your fingers before you even taste it." He leaned forward, staring into the fire, his eyes glowing with memories. He spoke of how, when the first big storm rolled in one winter, others panicked, their homes unready, their pantries bare. But he had stacked wood, salted meat, and laid-in supplies months before. While others scrambled, he weathered the storm, and when it passed, the town knew who had foresight worth following. That winter turned him from but a shopkeeper into a leader, the kind of man whose word meant survival. Wealth, he said, ain't just counted in dollars. Sometimes it counted in who folks turn to when the dark rolls in. Years trickled by in his telling like a stream under moonlight. His store expanded, his land grew, and soon he wasn't just a man with coins in a box. He was a man with influence, respect, and roots deep enough that storms couldn't shake him loose. Yet he kept his hat the same, boots the same, voice the same. Because the minute wealth changes who you are, he whispered, "You've lost more than you've gained." He described the joy not of spending, but of giving. He helped build the town's first schoolhouse, not because it earned him a dime, but because it meant children could read and dream bigger than their fathers did.
He paid wages fairer than any rival, so men left his store not richer in pocket, but richer in spirit. That the secret, he told, voice at gravel rolling steady. The richer the folks around you get in hope, in health, and trust, the richer you get yourself. The fire crackled low, and outside the rain softened to a mist. The cowboy sighed and let silence hang for Estelle. If he wanted his words to settle into the soil of the listener mind, then he added, "It don't take brilliance to build fortune. It takes faith. Faith that your effort matters, faith that tomorrow does, faith that if you do right long enough, the world will eventually do right by you. And if it don't, well, you'll still be a man worth remembering, and that a wealth no one can rob."
He leaned back in, letting the rhythm of the rain join the rhythm of his voice. "So you see, son, I never chased wealth the way others chased it. I tended to it to the fire, feeding it slow, steady, making sure it burned warm instead of wild. And when I look back now, sitting by this fire with more years behind me than ahead, I reckon that the kind of fortune a man can truly rest easy with. The fire spat sparks into the dim air, shadows crawling over the walls like ghosts of choicest past. He shifted, the leather of his chair groaning, and spoke on, his words deliberate as the steady clop of hooves on a dirt trail. What folks forget, he says, that wealth don't just stack up in a chest. It shapes a man, chisels him like stone, carves him into something steadier than before. You can't keep it separate from who you are. It either strengthens you or it consumes you. He told of a partner he once had, a man quick to spot opportunity but quicker still to demand reward. At first, their work was good. One handled the numbers, the other chased deals. But greed has a way of cracking foundations. This partner began skimming, hiding profits, thinking no one would notice, but wealth talks. The cowboy said, tapping a finger on his knee, it shows up in habits, in eyes, in the weight of a man handshake. The truth spilled eventually, the truth always does, and the partnership ended in bitterness. Yet the cowboy walked away with a lesson more valuable than gold. Choose your allies with care, for a crooked man can topple even the strongest foe. The rain hammered harder, as if echoing his point, but he carried on unbothered. After that, I learned not to count dollars, but to count character. I'd test a man before trusting him, not with grand promises, but with small tasks ones too minor to fake. If he honored the little, I knew he'd honor the large. It was how he built his circle of confidants, men and women who'd stand by him even when fortune faltered. That circle, he explained, was a fortress no thief could breach. Wealth guarded by trust, he said, is wealth that lasts. He spoke of ventures he entered that failed wagons lost to river floods, goods spoiled in summer heat, a storehouse fire that reduced months of labor to ash. Any one of those blows could have ended a lesser man. But he treated loss like a teacher, not a thief. Each mistake carved a notch into his understanding, sharpening him like a whetstone sharp pet steel. Folks think success is about winning every hand, he murmured, but truth is you just need to stay at the table long enough. The cards will turn if you keep playing smart. His hand drifted to the mug on the table, steam curling up but smoke from a slow-burning ember. I took a sip, sighed, and leaned into the glow. Don't let anyone fool you. Wealth does bring comfort. It lets you choose your work, not beg for it. It gives you freedom to say no when the world tries to chain you. But freedom itself, that's the real prize. Coins just buy you the chance to claim it. He remembered the day he bought his first patch of land. Not a grand ranch, not acres of lush pasture, but a rocky stretch by the river. Stubborn Ned's the man who chose it. Others thought it worthless, a fool purchase. But he cleared brush, built a shed, planted hardy crops, and watched day the land yielded more each season. Wealth, he said, ain't in what the world thinks something worth, in what you can estimate. That patch of land once laughed at became the cornerstone of his growing empire. And he never forgot the lesson. Value is born in effort, not in opinion. Lightning cracked, briefly painting the cabin in white fire. He didn't flinch, just chuckled low. Storms will come, boy. They'll test the seams of your roof, the strength of your walls, and the courage of your heart. But if you've built with patience and honesty, you'll stand firm while others scatter. His gaze fell heavy on the listener, and though daring them to remember that the difference between riches and wealth, riches can blow away in a storm. Wealth is what keeps the roof overhead when the wind howls. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the firelight catching the deep lines of his face. Now, I ain't telling you it easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd chosen right, if I'd sacrificed too much laughter for too much caution. But I'll tell you this, when morning came, and I saw my ledger steady, my land fertile, and my people fed, I knew the weight was worth bearing. What the Friday will smile then, not wide but deep, the kind that carried years of hard lessons. He raised his mug in a quiet toast to no one in particular. So if you're asking what the secret is, it ain't in any one trick. It in living steady, in making each choice count, in knowing wealth ain't built in a day, but in a lifetime of fires you keep burning through storm and silence alike. He took a long sip, let the rain drum its chorus on the roof, and finally leaned back, letting silence take root again. The cowboy shifted in his chair, the old wood creaking like it remembered stories of its own. His eyes traced the flames as though each flicker carried a memory. Funny thing about wealth, he drawled, is that it sneaks up on you. One day you're counting pennies, worried how to stretch a dollar till it don't scream, and the next you realize you built something bigger than yourself.
Don't come with fanfare, no banners or horns, just a quiet morning where you see what you've tended growing strong, and you know you've carved your mark on this world. He told of times when temptation near dragged him off course. A scheme near a shortcut their ways that promised riches faster than an honest day labor. But quick money, he said, voice low, burns ice-dried tinder, flashes bright, hot enough to blind you, then it gone, leaving you colder than before. He had watched men chase those flashes, their pockets bulging for a season only to crumble when the fire died. Some ended bitter, a desperate had gone entirely. That wasn't a path he'd let himself walk, not once he'd learned the cost. Instead, he carved his way slow like a river cutting through stone. Little trade, small profits, reinvested and watched like a hawk. He poured back into the land, into folks he trusted, into ventures steady enough to weather storms. And storms came, he reminded, his gaze turning sharp. They always do. A man who don't expect him is a man who won't last long. Floods took half his crop once, locusts another year, and yet each blow was softened by the way he'd prepared.
Had stores of grain, savings tucked away, debts paid early, preparation ain't fear, he said, shaking his head. It respect for time, for chance, for the truth that nothing lasts forever if you don't tend to it. The fire hissed, the rain seeped down the chimney, but he spoke over it, voice steady, you gotta understand. Money is only a mirror. It reflects the man holding it. A fool grows reckless with gold, thinking it'll never run out. A coward clings so tight he never lets it breathe, never lets it multiply. But a wise man, he tipped his head, eyes gleaming under the brim of his hat. A wise man treats it like a partner, lets it work, lets it grow, but never forgets who led in the dance. He leaned back then, shoulders relaxing as though he'd just laid down another heavy truth. The storm out rattled the windows, thunder rumbling like hooves on distant plains. He seemed to listen for a moment, then nodded, as if the sky itself agreed. Every dollar I earned, I sent out like a scout. Some came back empty-handed, some never came back at all, but enough returned with spoils that I built something worth passing on, that the way of it, risk and reward, always side by side, outriders sharing the same trail. The cowboy tone softened, he told of the people he'd helped along the way. A young boy whose family lost their farm. He gave him work and a roof, and years later that boy ran one of his most trusted outposts. A widow struggling to make ends meet, he invested in her shop, and together they turned it into a cornerstone of the town. Wealth ain't tut numbers on a page, he said quietly. It lives lifted, chance given, legacies planted. His voice carried weight then, heavier than gold. A man who hoards wealth dies rich but forgotten. A man who shares it dies remembered. The fire popped, showering sparks as stars against the dark, and he let silence sit for a spell before speaking again. Now don't mistake me, I ain't no saint. I've been selfish, I've been stubborn, I've held back when I should have given, but I learned. And if you're listening, if you take nothing else from my rambling, take this, measure your wealth not by what you keep, but by what you leave behind. The cowboy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes burning with the same light as the fire before him. Someday when I'm gone, there'll be no chest of gold buried in the hills. What I'll leave is stronger. I'll leave a trail for others to follow, one lit by the choices I made and the lives I touched. That trail is my true fortune, and it will outlast me. Same way this storm will outlast the night. The rain beat steady on the roof, the campfire glow dancing against the walls, and for a long moment his words hummed heavy in the air. The cowboy let his words hang for a while, leaning back so the chair groaned under his weight. The storm was still thumping steady on the tin roof, but inside it was warm. The fire glow keeping the shadows at bay. He rubbed the brim of his hat with slow fingers, then spoke in, his voice lower now, like he was letting the secret slip out, for those who stuck around long enough to listen. You see, he began, wealth ain't just about the coins or the bills. It's about knowing when to plant and when to harvest, when to take the long road instead of the shortcut. There were times I wanted quick results, times I thought maybe I was a fool for doing things the slow way. But every time I looked back, I could see the steady climb, the proof that patience is its own kind of currency. Every sunrise I was still standing. I knew I was richer than the day before. He paused, gazing into the fiery, though seeing the faces of old friends. I remember one winter, he said, voice thick with memory. where most folks near lost everything. Prices crashed, jobs dried up, and the land turned mean. But I'd spent the years before building more than my own pile of wealth. I built ties, connections with folks who'd help pay the same bill and help them. When the storm hit, we shared what we had. Some gave food, some gave shelter, some gave time. That when I learned the truest wealth is community. Alone, a man gets buried. Together we survive. He shifted forward, elbows on his knees, his face lit by the flames, and don't mistake me. Helping others don't mean charity without thought. It means investing in folks the way you invest in land or stock. Sometimes it pays back in ways you can't count on paper. Sometimes it don't. But the measure ain't in the return, it in the strength you build bound you. A man surrounded by trust and loyalty is richer than a king with gold stacked high, but no one to share it with. The cowboy hand tightened around the arm of his chair, knuckles white for a moment before relaxing. Now I've seen men who thought they were untouchable because they held the purse strings tight. Thought fear kept people close, but fear don't last when their fortunes turned. And they always do. They found themselves alone, abandoned by the very people they looked down on. Pride makes a man think money buys loyalty, but truth is, only respect and fairness can hold a bond. Without those, wealth is brittle. The storm out cracked with thunder, the sound rolling and whack iron wheels across the plains. The cowboy didn't flinch, but tipped his head like he was listening to an old tune. I've lived long enough to know money don't quiet storms, he said. But wisdom, preparation, and kindness, they'll see you through. You build a fortune on greed, it'll scatter with the first hard wind. You build it on purpose, on discipline, on a willingness to share. That fortune grows roots. It weathers time. He chuckled then, low and rough like gravel sliding down a hillside. I once had a friend smarter a whip, sharper than me at numbers. He made his fortune twice as fast, but he spent it twice as quick too, chasing thrills, buying folks' admiration, thinking that was wealth. When the bottom fell out, he came knocking at my door, pockets empty, eyes tired. I gave him work, gave him a chance to rebuild, but he never could steady himself, never learned the patience. Died broke, still chasing that quick flame. The cowboy eyes softened, a sadness tucked deep in the lines of his face. He taught them much of my own mistakes as did, showed him what path not to take. He leaned back again, letting the fire warm his boots. Wealth is like this storm, loud at times, unpredictable, powerful, but you don't fight it head on. You prepare, you endure, and when it passes, you step out stronger than before. The man who understands that truth, well, he'll never want for nothing, 'cause he knows every hardship carries a lesson, and every lesson is worth more than gold. The cowboy reached for the tin cup at his side, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. His voice turned softer still, almost a whisper lost in the crackle of the fire. In the end, son, it ain't about the wealth you gather, it's about the kind of man gathering it. A fortune in the hands of a fool is a curse. A small purse in the hands of a wise man can turn into a legacy. That the real secret, that the trail worth following. He let the words settle like embers dying down, the silence holding heavier than thunder. Outside, the rain softened, tapping gentle on the roof, although even the storm had quieted to hear. The cowboy shifted his weight, leaning forward so the fire carved shadows deeper across his weather face. His eyes, worn but sharp, scanned the room like he was weighing the worth of every memory, every decision that had led him there. Funny thing about wealth, he said, his voice slow, the kind that makes a man lean close so he don't miss a word. It don't just sit in your pockets, it lives in your habits, your choices, your daily reckoning. Each sunrise gives you another chance to stack bricks on the foundation you've been laying all along. As he slobbered clear, your real fortune lives is not in the bank, not in stock ledger, not even in the land under your boots. It in your heart and in your will. If those two are steady, everything else follows. Lose them, and no amount of gold will keep you upright. His gaze drifted to the flames, eyes reflecting orangely molten metal. I've seen men break themselves trying to look rich, buying wagons they couldn't pull, building houses too wide to heat, spending coin on trinkets that lost their shine the moment they were bought. They thought appearances meant security, but when lean times came, all they had were empty halls and heavier debts. Wealth built on showing off ain't worth the paper it's scrawled on. The cowboy chuckled, the sound dry and mesquite bark catching flame. Me, I learned early that the quiet coin lasts the longest, the kind you save when no one watching. The kind you invest in tools, books, land that feeds you. Ain't nobody applaud when you live humble, but when the dust storms roll and the markets tumble, that when the humble man stands tall, he ain't dependent on applause or show. He had built himself a shelter from storms, leaned back creaking chair protesting under his weight, and pulled his hat lower, shadow in his eyes, and don't think I mean denying yourself every comfort. Now, a man gotta live, a good meal, a warm coat, a gift for your kin when they need lifting, that money well spent. But the line between comfort and waste is finer than a horsehair. A man who learns to see it, he'll ride farther than one blinded by want. His voice softened, turning into the kind of tone that felt like advice whispered over a campfire in the dead of night. The secret ain't denying joy, son. It's choosing joy that lasts. A fine meal fades quick. Teach your kin to cook that feeds them for life. A new horse shines today, but a barn full of feed and a pasture strong will keep horses minning for years. Every choice you make should ask this: does it end indeed, or does it grow tomorrow? The fire pot, spitting sparks that rose and died, like fleeting fortunes. The cowboy watched them fade before speaking then. I once bartered with a man who ran a general store. He kept prices fair, shelves steady, but he never kept much for himself. Folks trusted him, leaned on him. When his time came and the store passed to his boy, that trust was the inheritance. That boy didn't inherit just a shop. He inherited a town faith. And you can't put a price on that. That wealth you can't count, but everyone feels. His voice took on a firmer edge, carrying the weight of storms, weather, and mistakes endured. They're a law of the land, same as gravity. Greed breaks faster than it builds. Patience grows stronger the longer it tended. And generosity, done wisely, multiplies in ways you can't track till years later. It like sowing seeds in ground you might never walk again. One day, someone else will find shade there and they'll never know your name, but your work will be standing. That legacy. He drew in a breath, slow and deliberate. But he was filling his lungs with more than air, like he was breathing in every story he'd lived. You'll be tempted, son. Mark my words. Quick deals, promises too good. Folks will tell you the road is shorter if you just cut through. But the shortcut where men lose their boots, the long trail, steady and sure that ride, the one that leads to real treasure, and by the time you arrive, you'll realize the treasure wasn't at the end of the trail it at. It was the man you became walking it. The cowboy voice fell quiet, the words drifting into the storm. Hush outside. Only the fire spoke for a spell, crackling where the old earth itself was nodding in agreement. He let the silence hold, then tipped his hat back dead enough for the light to catch the faintest smile creased into his weather face. Remember, he murmured, wealth ain't about gathering what shines. It's about becoming the kind of man who don't lose his way when the shine fades. That's the real fortune worth passing on. The cowboy shifted his boots a little closer to the fire, dragging a streak of dust across the worn floorboards, the embers reflecting in his eyes like distant stars. He took his time before speaking again, letting the storm out gummed against the cabin walls. There a rhythm to earning and keeping money. Same made a trail song, he said, low and steady. You will march to face, thinking you'll get to the destination quicker, but you'll wear your horse down before sundown. Or you can pace yourself step by step, keeping time with patience and sense. That rhythm, that what gets a man farther than greed on the pile. He set his mug down, the tin ringing faint against the wood, and pointed a finger upward like he was drawing in the air. Folks often ask me how I kept going when things got lean. Truth is, lean times are teachers in disguise. They strip away what don't matter, show you which parts of your life are ballast and which are sails. If you've been throwing coin at showy things, lean times will expose you quick, but if you've invested in skills, in know-how, and resources that outlive the season, you'll not only weather the storm, you'll come out tougher on the other side. The fire flared as if to nod, and the cowboy face took on a faraway look. I remember one winter, he said, his words drifting like smoke when the river froze over and the wagons couldn't get through. Store shelves emptied faster than the sun sets on a short day. Men with shallow roots panicked. They'd been leaning on what others hauled in, never planting their own. But I'd put time into learning to smoke meat, store beans, mend deer. Not fancy skills, not flashy, but useful. And when that winter stretched long, those simple things turned into gold. I traded knowledge for goods, helped others get by, and came out of it not poorer but richer. in ways coin couldn't count. He let that sink in, the lesson hanging between crackles of pine. You see, real wealth is less about what you own and more about what you can create, sustain, and share. A man with empty pockets but a strong back, a sharp mind, and a steady spirit, he richer than a fool with full pockets and no sense, because when the pocket's empty, the fool got nothing left. But the man with skills and spirit, he just builds it again. The cowboy shifted, leaning back so the chair sighed under him. His voice deepened with certainty. That's why I tell young folks, don't chase quick riches, chase strong roots. Plant them deep education, discipline, grit, and a code you don't compromise on. Roots that dig into the soil of your character, not at your wallet, because storms always come, always. And when they do, only roots hold you fast. He smiled faintly, eyes softening at the memory of lessons learned the hard way. Now, he'll laugh at you for saving when you could be spending. Some will call you foolish for working steady when others are gambling their way to what looks like fortune. But wait long enough and you'll see most of those gamblers vanish, their wealth blowing away like tumbleweed, while you'll still be standing. Maybe quiet, maybe unnoticed, but solid as oak. And oak don't need applause to be mighty. The fire popped, sending sparks floating into the rafters, shadows dancing like a restless ghost. The cowboy voice softened into a near whisper. He was letting the fire carry his words. Your wealth is your rhythm, your daily steps, your quiet choices. The world will try to lure you in your noise into thinking wealth is something you can shout about. But the truth is, the quiet builders, the patient savers, the men who keep their code steady, they're the ones who end up with legacies. They may not shine like lightning, but they endure like the mountains. He reached into his coat, pulling out a pocket watch old enough that its shine had worn smooth, its tick faint but steady. He turned it over in his palm, the metal catching the glow of the fire. Time your truest coin, he said. You spend it every day, whether you rue it or not. Some spend it on worry, or on vanity, and on pleasures that vanish as smoke. But if you spend it on learning, on growing, on building a future worth passing on, that when time pays you back, double and triple. The cowboy closed the watch with a soft click, slid it back into his pocket, and leaned forward again, elbows resting on his knees. So don't ask yourself how much you've got in the bank. Ask yourself how much you've got in your heart, in your skills, in your patience, in the trust others place in you. Because when all's said and done, them are the only riches you take with you into the dark, and I reckon they're the only ones that matter. He tipped his hat lower, shading his eyes from the firelight, and let the storm outside speak for a moment. Its rhythm made the heartbeat of the land. Then, slowly dawned raking, he added, wealth is built in silence, tested in storms, and remembered in stories. And if you could live so your story helps the next soul along their trail, well, that the richest a man can be. The old cowboy hand drifted over the scarred arm of the chair, feeling the grooves carved by years of sitting fireside, and he let his words ride out slow, like cattle driven easy under a watchful moon. What most folks don't grasp, he said, voice low air, the thunder muttering outside, is that money ain't never the whole pith. It a tool, sure, but no more than a hammer, a house, or a saddle, a horse. What matters is who using it and what they're building. I've seen men ruin themselves by letting money use them instead of the other way round. That's the difference between a rancher with a legacy and a drifter with empty pockets. How they treat the tools they're given. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes catching the firelight like lanterns cutting through fog. There was a time I nearly lost the trail myself. Chased after something shiny, convinced it was my chance to cut the line and strike quick gold. Poured every dime and every ounce of energy into a scheme that promised more than it could deliver. When it collapsed, I was left staring at the ashes of my own making, but even then, sitting broke and bitter on the edge of town, I realized something that saved me. The world can take your coin, your cattle, your land, but it can't take your grit unless you give it away. And grit, the soil that lets wealth grow again. The wind pressed against the cabin, whining through the cracks, but the cowboy words rolled on steady. I built back slow, started with odd jobs, fixing saddles, clearing brush, hauling supplies. Every coin I made, I split into 3 piles. What I needed, what I'd save, and what I'd sow. That last pile, the one for sowing, went into ventures that weren't about fast returns, but steady ground. A neighbor needed seed money to expand his herd. I invested, not that a gambad, but that a partner. Another fella had the tools, but not the means to repair wagons. I lent him a hand, and a cut of the profit came back my way. It wasn't flashy, but each little seed grew, and soon enough I wasn't surviving. I was building something that could weather storms. He paused, breathing deep of the cedar smoke rising up, eyes soft as the glow spreading across the hearth. You see, boy, that the kind of wealth that sticks, not the kind built on luck or debt or show, the kind that comes from building slow, honest, and fair. It don't grab headlines, but it'll feed your family and earn you the kind of respect you can't buy. The cowboy tipped his hat back, showing the lines carved by time across his brow. There's something else, too. Wealth, real wealth, ain't meant to be hoarded. It meant to move, to pass through hands, to grow when shared. I gave work to men who needed it, fair wages that let them stand tall, and in return, they stood by me when lean years circled back. That circle, that trust, that worth more than any stack of gold coins, 'cause gold can be stolen, trust can't be taken. It only lost if you rake it. The storm gave a sudden roar, and the cowboy chuckled soft, like he'd heard that sound 1,000 times. Funny thing is, the lean years taught to more than the fat ones did. Taught to live life, to keep my wagon loaded only with what mattered. When you ain't tied down with clutter, you're free to move where the horizon calls. That freedom, that a kind of wealth too, one most men don't reckon with, that they're already chained by debts and duties they can't outrun. He reached for his coffee, sipping it slow, though it had gone lukewarm, and set the cup back with care. So here's the truth I learned on the long road. Wealth ain't about stacking high, it's about standing firm. It's about choices made day by day, dollar by dollar, even breath by breath. You don't wake up rich by chance. You wake up richer every time you say no to what don't matter and yes to what builds. And you keep walking that trail until one day you look back and see the wide field you've planted behind you. That when you know you've made it, not when you strike gold, but when you've laid down roots strong enough that even your great-grandchildren will feel the shade of the tree you planted. The cowboy leaned back, letting the chair creak, eyes drifting toward the window. It lightened and lit the night in brief flashes. His voice dropped softer now, but if he was speaking more to himself than anyone else. And when the fire dies and the storm passes, and then you've got left is the memory of the road you walked, well, if you could smile at that, then you've been wealthy in the truest sense all along. The fire had settled low, embers pulsing like the last heartbeat of the day, and the cowboy shifted his boots close, drawing warmth from the coals. He cleared his throat slow and gravelly and let the silence stretch before he spoke again. You'll notice how these men are quick to measure wealth by what jingles in their pocket or shines in their vault. They parade through town with boots too polished, hats too stiff, and wagons loaded down with goods they don't need but can't stop showing off. But I'll tell you something, those fellas are poor in a way no coin can mend. They ain't poor in money, they're poor in spirit. They got no peace when the lights go dim, no quiet satisfaction when the day work is done. That a kind of poverty worse than hunger, 'cause it eats at a man's soul till he hollow inside. He rubbed at his jaw, the scrape of whiskers rasping under his hand. I learned that lesson from a banker in a city not far from there. Sharp dresser, fast talker, pockets always full. But his eyes, they were restless, darting like a horse that smelt smoke on the wind. One night, over whiskey, he confessed to me he'd never known a good night's sleep in 15 years. Said every dollar he'd piled up had brought another fear. Fear of losing it. Fear of being cheated. Fear of being forgotten if you weren't the richest man in the room. He was trapped, not by iron bars, but by chains of his own making. When I walked away that night, I knew I'd rather be a broke ranch hand sleeping under the stars than a rich man shackled to shadows. The cowboy gaze softened dead. He thought back, the rain-out tide tapping steady on the roof. See, real wealth don't chase you. You don't have to guard it with a pistol under your pillow. It grows slow and steady like a good crop or a herd well tended. You check on it, you feed it, you water it with patience and wisdom, but you don't smother it with greed. That's why the man who saves a little each week, invests in his neighbors, teaches his children discipline. He ends with more than the loud-mouth flashing bills at the saloon, 'cause his wealth ain't just in numbers, but in the respect he earns, the peace he keeps, and the legacy he builds. He tipped his hat back, staring up at the roof beams, as if they held the memories of every lesson he carried. I remember when I finally bought back a piece of land, after losing near everything. It wasn't much, just a few acres with a crooked fence and a shack leaning worse than a drunk. But I walked that ground barefoot, felt the soil between my toes, and I knew I had something real. I fixed that fence board by board, patched that shack till it stood proud again, and planted seed with my own calloused hands. The first harvest weren't grand, but it was mine, earned honest and hard. And sitting on that porch with a bowl of stew made from my own field, I realized I was richer than I'd have been riding borrowed glory or chasing schemes. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes burning steady. The trick ain't never been about getting lucky, it's about making steady choices when luck runs dry. It's about saying no to the quick fix and yes to the grind that don't pay off today, but will carry you through tomorrow. Folks don't write songs about that kind of man, but they sure remember him when the storms come. The one whose roof don't cave, whose pantry ain't empty, whose word still holds weight when the winds blow fierce. The cowboy reached down and tossed another log onto the fire, sparks spitting up beneath to have to punctuate his thought. And I'll tell you something else, wealth don't just live in the hands of the one who earns it. It flows out like a river, touching everyone downstream. When I paid fair wages, those men fed their families. When I bought supplies from the local smith instead of their big city outfit, I kept his forge burning and his children clothed. That ripple, it comes back, not always in coin, but in loyalty, in trust, in a town that stands stronger together than it could apart. That the kind of wealth no thief can steal, no market can crash, no drought can wither. The cowboy voice dropped to a murmur almost lost under the rain. So don't measure your worth by how much silver you stack in a chest. Measure it by how much stronger the folks around you stand, 'cause you walk this earth. That's the gold that lasts. The kind of legacy no fire, flood, or famine can wash away. And when you sit by your last campfire staring into the coals, you'll know you lived wealthy if you can say you left the world better than you found it. The cowboy sat back, letting the weight of his words drift into the hush that followed. The storm outside had softened, the rain no longer pounding but whispering against the cabin walls like a tired lullaby. He took in the silence, then spoke again, slower this time, each syllable carrying the gravity of years, lived hard and lessons paid in sweat. You see, boy, it ain't about what you got in the barn or stacked in the bank. It's about what kind of man you become along the way. Wealth a funny thing, it can build you or it can rake you. It can feed you or it can starve you. It all depends on how you treat it. He rubbed the brim of his hat, thumbs sliding along the other leather. I once rode with a rancher who thought wealth was measured in how many heads of cattle a man could own. He bought land he couldn't manage, took on loans he couldn't repay, and built barns so tall they blocked out the sunrise. Folks admired him for a spell, called him the richest man this side of the county, but greed a river that cuts its own banks. Soon enough, a dry season came and that man couldn't keep up with his debts. His herd starved, his barn stood empty, and those same folks who praised him whispered about his fall. He left town with nothing but the clothes on his back. His fortune had been wide, but it had no roots, and wealth without roots is sand slipping through your fingers. The cowboy shifted in his chair, leaning into the glow of the fire. His eyes shone like coals reflecting. Memory now contrasts that with another man I knew, an old hand who never owned much land, but every acre he tilled was cared for like kin. He raised a modest herd, tended his soil, and lived well within his means. Come bad season, he tightened his belt but never starved. Come good season, he saved what he could and invested in what lasted. New plows, stronger fences, education for his children. That man's name don't roll off the tongue like a legendary cattle baron, but to this day his grandchildren walk proud, holding on to the wealth he left them, not just in coin, but in wisdom and resilience. He let the fire crackle, then nodded at his speaking to himself that the heart of wealth, knowing when enough is enough, greed will blind a man, but contentment clears the path. When you understand that, every dollar you earn has purpose, every step you take has weight. You don't chase riches like a fool chases shadows. You build wealth like a craftsman carves wood patient, deliberate, steady. And when the storm hits, you'll find your house standing, not because it was the biggest, but because it was built on solid ground. His voice hardened now, like iron tempered in flame. There are danger in the world today. Folks get sold the dream of getting rich quick. Shiny advertisements, silver-tongued sellers, promises of fortunes overnight. But the truth is, easy wealth is brittle. It don't bend, it breaks. Real wealth takes time, sweat, and sacrifice. You can't cheat that process any more than you take the sunrise early. And the man who tries is setting himself up for ruin. He leaned closer to the fire, shadow stretching across his face. I'll tell you something most men don't want to hear. Wealth is boring. It ain't flashy, it ain't loud. It's the quiet habit of saving when you'd rather spend it. It's the steady work of tending investments when you'd rather gamble. At choosing patience over pride, discipline over desire. Ain't no one gonna clap for you when you pass on the new horse or say no to the saloon. But years later, when you've built something that lasts, folks will wonder how you did it. And you smile, knowing it wasn't magic, just the power of small choices made right. The cowboy hand rested on his knee, fingers drumming slow. Wealth is like the fire we're sitting by. If you tend it steady, feed it right, and give it air, it'll warm you for a lifetime, but neglect it, or worse, try to burn it hot and fast, and you'll be left in the cold staring at ashes. Too many men don't understand that. They think brighter flames mean Longdon fires, but those of us who've sat through long winters know it's the embers that matter. Welcome, dreamer. Tonight, as the gentle rain taps on your window and the fire crackles softly nearby, let yourself drift into a world of possibility. Imagine waking up tomorrow with clarity, purpose, and the steps to build wealth that lasts.
Don't worry, it won't come back to build them or your cat in the city to live like the hammer, not the house, the saddle, not the journey. You would have to build something bigger life worth living, a family worth protecting, a legacy worth living. Don't let the truth fool you into thinking that the treasure is what you build with. It's fire pot, a shower of sparks, dancing up the chimney like stars raking loose. The cowboy watching rise and then settle back into the chair. The voice softened again. So when you measure your life, don't count dollars, count the other share, count promises kept, count nights left in peace, and you'll find the wealth that outlives you. That's the kind of fortune a man can take with him when the trail comes to it. The cowboy tilted his head and listened to the rhythm of the rain. Later it carried those secrets that old man knew. The voice when it came was rough and gravel, that calm as a lullaby. You would notice how storms roll in unexpected. Clear sky one minute, thunder the next. Life the same way. Wealth ain't just about gathering gold when the sun's shining. It's about being ready when clouds come.
Too many folks only band for the fair weather. They live high, buying what they don't need, boasting about what they got. But when the storm hits, they're running for cover, begging for shelter. The man who wires, he builds his shelter before the rain falls. That's the difference between those who thrive and those who crumble. He leaned forward, poker in hand, stirring the embers as if punctuating his words. I recall a woman out 8 ran a general store on a dusty road. Most folks didn't bother traveling. She never sold much on a single day, but she kept at it. Every coin she made, she set aside a little. People laughed at her, said she was foolish, saving when she barely had enough to eat. But she held firm, saying it wasn't about today, it was about tomorrow. Years passed, and when the railroad finally came through, her little shop sat right where the track ended. Overnight, it turned into the busiest trade stop for miles. She didn't get rich by chance. She got rich by being ready when opportunity showed up. But that wealth, boy, wealth ain't luck. It's preparation, meeting opportunity. The cowboy eyes softened. Let the firelight was reflecting an old wound. I've also seen the opposite. A young man inherited a fortune from his daddy, a ranch, a herd, a house grand enough to host a governor. He lived wild, spending like the money would never run dry. Horses, whiskey, cards, went, the whole lot. Folks envied him, but I watched close, knowing that fortune had no foundation. Sure enough, within 10 years, he was selling off piece by piece, begging lenders for another chance. Last I heard, he was working cattle for wages on land that used to be his. You see, easy come, easy go. Fortune you have sweat for won't stick to your bones. It'll slip through you like water through open fingers. He sighed, letting the word settle for carrying on. Now don't mistake me. I ain't saying you ought to fear money. Money a fine thing. It buys freedom, buys time, buys choices. But you got to be the master of it, not the servant. Once you start serving money, you'll make decisions that rot your soul. You'll cut corners, betray friends, even trade your integrity for a handful of coins. And let it tell you, no amount of wealth can patch a man's conscience once it's torn. The cowboy took a sip from his tin cup, the steam curling into the cabin air. Discipline is the word most men don't want to hear. Discipline builds wealth the way steady rains fill a river. It ain't dramatic, it ain't fast, but over time it carves veils and shapes the land. Every day you choose to save, to invest, to live within your means, you're building a river that'll carry you far. Folks who wait for the flood, who gamble on quick riches, they end up washed away. But the disciplined man is still standing when the waters rise and fall, or the rain outlined and grew heavier, drumming steady at hooves on packed earth. The cowboy tapped his boot against the floorboards in rhythm. There say I carry with we to don't spend your future on today comfort. Too many trade long-term peace for short-term pleasure. They buy shiny wagons, big houses, or clothes they can't afford, and in doing so they chain themselves to debt, to worry, to restless nights. The man who resists that urge, who finds joy in simplicity, he's the man who'll sleep easy. No matter what storms rage outside, he looked toward the window where the dark pressed against the glass and spoke softer, almost like a prayer. A man true wealth ain't measured by how much he can buy, but by how little he truly needs. When you've trained yourself to be content with the simple good food, warm fire, honest work, You built a fortress no thief or storm can breach. That the kind of wealth that makes a man untouchable. And funny enough, it's that very mindset that often leads to riches. Because content men ain't careless men. They grow slow, steady, and sure. And before long, they find themselves standing on ground solid enough to pass to their children. The cowboy let the words linger like smoke, then leaned back, his chair creaking under the weight of time, tipped his hat low, the brim shadow in his eyes, and gave a faint smile. So, when you chase wealth, don't chase it for the shine. Chase it for the security, for the freedom, for the peace it brings. Do that, and you won't just die rich. You'll die satisfied. And that, son, is the finest kind of wealth there is. The cowboy let the fire settle into a slow crackle, the kind of sound that fills the silence without demanding attention. His hands, leathered and worn from years of rope and rein, rested easy on his knees, though the weight of his words was all that needed carrying now. Let me tell you something I learned from a fella named Jeremiah, a ranch hand who came west with nothing but a burlap sack and a stubborn will. Man couldn't read nor write much, but he understood value better than any banker I met. Each week, when we got our pay, most of the boys ran to town, whiskey, cards, trouble. But Jeremiah, he'd set aside just one coin in a little tin box every real week, rain or shine. Didn't look like much at first. Folks even mocked him, said one coin wouldn't change a life. But years went by, and when a patch of land came up for sale, Jeremiah opened that tin and had just enough to buy it outright. He didn't borrow, didn't beg, he owned it clear. That little ranch grew into something mighty, all because the man never underestimated the power of consistency. The old cowboy poked at the fire again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. That's what most folks get wrong. They think wealth comes from grand gestures, big breaks, or lucky strike. Truth is, it's the little habits, the choices you make when no one watching, that stack into something greater. Jeremiah didn't have education, connections, or fortune, but he had discipline. And discipline is a currency stronger than gold. He leaned back, eyes reflecting the flames like a man staring at memories too heavy to hold. Now, I've seen other men who had all the right chance but wasted him a water spilling from a leaky bucket. One young hand I rode with, named Charles, inherited his daddy ranch when he was S-20. Land rich, cattle strong, barns full. But Charles never respected the sweat that built it. He borrowed against the land to fund his trips east, spent money on things that glittered but gave no return. Within a decade, the ranch was gone, sold to cover his debts. Last I saw him, he was drifting from town to town, looking for work, telling stories about the empire he once owned. That boy never understood that money ain't permanent. It's a river, and if you don't guide it, it'll wash away. The rain outside beat harder against the roof. As if echoing his words, Wealth the cowboy said slowly, ain't just about what you gather, it's about what you protect. A man who don't shield his cerners is like a rancher who builds fences but never checks for breaks. One weak spot and the whole herd can scatter. That's why saving and guarding what you earn is important to any. Earning might, in the first place. So took a deep breath, then added, but don't mistake guarding for hoarding. A hoarder clutches his coins like a miser, never letting them work that fear and not wisdom. Jeremiah, he didn't keep his coins buried. He waited for the right chance, then put him to work on land that grew more value each year. That the lesson, money hid is stagnant. Money invested is alive. You want your wealth to breed, to grow roots and branches that'll shade you when you're old. And you do that by planting it in the right soil. The cowboy paused, letting the firelight flicker across his face. Another truth folks don't want to face is that patience is the hardest part of wealth. Everyone wants to reap before they sow. They look at a neighbor fortune and think, why not me and why not now? But fortune don't bow to impatience. Jeremiah Ranch didn't grow overnight. It was built coin by coin, season by season, year by year. Patience is the bridge between where you are and where you want to be. Without it, you'll jump into rivers that drown you. Instead of building bridges that carry you across, the storm out seemed to soften, the thunder rolling off into the distance as though the night itself was agreeing with him. He rubbed at his beard thoughtful. Let me give you another cure. A banker I once knew in a dusty town south of Fed had a rule. He lived on half his income, no matter how much he made. The other half he saved or invested. When he was young, folks pitied him, said he was too stingy, never enjoying life. But when he got older, that man had enough wealth to help others, to build schools, to lend fair, to shape a whole community. He lived simple, sure, but he built a legacy that outlasted him. That a truth money don't tell you up front. Real wealth ain't just about you. It's about what you leave behind. He chuckled softly, a sound of gravel rolling in a stream. Now, don't get me wrong. You should enjoy the road while you're walking it. A good meal, a warm coat, a night laughter, they're worth spending on. But balance it. Don't eat your seed when you should be planting. There's a season for sowing and a season for harvest, and a wise man knows which season he's standing in. The cowboy finally leaned forward, both hands on his knees, staring at the embers. You take one thing from this, let it be this. Wealth don't come to the fastest, the loudest, or the luckiest. It ups to the steadier, to the one who save when others spend, who invests when others waste, who waits when others rush. Be steady, boy. Build your wealth. If you build a fire, small sticks first, then bigger logs, tend it careful, and soon enough it'll blaze bright enough to light your whole life. The old cowboy stirred the fire again, sparks drifting up into the night, like tiny reminders of how little things add up to something grand if you give him time. His voice came slow, like the words were weighted with years of walking long trails. I remember a boy named Samuel, youngest of 7, growing up in a house where every dime had to stretch with taffy. His daddy worked the mines, his mama sewed by candlelight, but even in that kind of poverty, Samuel learned something powerful. He'd find scraps, bits of wire, nails, tin lids, and he'd trade them with the neighbors for eggs or flour. By the time he was 15, he wasn't just surviving, he was running a little barter set that gave his family a cushion on the hardest weeks. Now that might sound like nothing, just a boy hustling scraps, but let it tell you it was the first stones in a found that later held up a mansion. Samuel grew to be a man who understood that value ain't always coins or bills. Sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes it's connections, sometimes it's plain grit, and he built wealth out of all three. The cowboy let out a sigh heavy with memory. What Samuel showed thee was that wealth begins with recognition, seeing what others overlook. While folks walked past scraps, he saw trade. While neighbors complained of lack, he saw opportunity. Wealth ain't magic, it's perception. Some men see obstacles, others see paths. Which think you are decides where you'll end up. The rain picked up in, drumming steady against the cabin roof. The old man tapped his boot against the wood floor, keeping rhythm with it. There another tale worth telling, a fella named Hector, Mexican hand who came north looking for work. He spoke little English, but numbers, he understood them, but they were you. Every payday he'd send a portion back to his family, but he'd also keep a small part to invest. He wasn't reckless. He'd study where cattle prices were headed, where the railroads were building, that the towns were spreading. He'd put his little bits of savings into places that would grow. Within 10 years, Hector owned land that others thought he'd never touch. Folks laughed at him once, saying a foreigner couldn't carve out fortune there, but by the time his hair gayed, he was employing men who once mocked him. That man didn't let prejudice decide his future. He let preparation and patience do it. The cowboy eyes narrowed at the flames, like he was searching for something beyond the fire edge. Hector taught me another truth. Wealth don't care about where you're from, how you talk, or who your daddy was. It cares about discipline, foresight, and courage. The world will hand you reasons why you can't. Wealth will hand you reasons why you should try, but you gotta pick which hand you grab. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under him. Now you'll hear folks spinning tales of fortunes built in sudden wind strikes of silver, poker winnings, inheritances, but most of those burn out quick as they catch fire. The strongest wealth, the kind that carries a man through storms, is slow-burn wealth, built steady, guarded wise, invested with vision. A man who wins a pile of money may look rich, but if he don't have the habits to hold it, that pile will vanish like smoke. But the man who builds slow, who practices saving, learning, and growing, his wealth stays 'cause it rooted in habit, not happenstance. The fire hissed that a log shifted, spilling embers like stars across the dirt floor. The cowboy face softened. I knew a widow once, name of Margaret, who never had more than a seamstress wages. Folks pitied her, said she'd never see better days. But Margaret had something stronger than pity, resolve. She took in sewing work, lived on next to nothing, and set aside every spare penny. Over time, she started lending small sums to neighbors, just enough to help them through hard spots. But she charged fair interest, not cruel, not greedy. Those small loans grew into a little fund, and that fund grew into investments. By the time Margaret was old, she wasn't as comfortable. She was respected, known as the woman who helped others climb while she climbed herself. You'd never guess it looking at her plain dresses, but her wealth was quiet, powerful, and decent. He shook his head, almost silent. What Margaret proved is that you don't need a high wage to build wealth. You need consistency, integrity, and patience. And maybe that's the hardest truth for folks to swallow. They want wealth quick, they want it showy, and they want it easy. But real wealth don't care about your wants. It demands discipline. It demands you treat today penny like it tomorrow dollar. It demands you live beneath your means so your future can rise above your present. The cowboy leaned forward again, his voice firmer now. And let me tell you plain, wealth ain't selfish. If all you're doing is building a pile for yourself, you'll die rich but forgotten. Wealth, truth, purpose is to give a man freedom and to let him shape the world kinder than he found it. Samuel barters, Hector land, Margaret loans, they weren't just about coins, they were about changing the lives around them. That way true wealth lives, not in banks or barns, but in the difference you eat with what you've built. The storm outside softened, the rain turned into a drizzle that the night itself was leaning in to listen. The cowboy words slowed, his voice rough but steady. So, when you think of wealth, don't piles of gold or ledgers full of numbers. Picture freedom, picture legacy, picture a fire that keeps burning long after you've walked on. That what you're building stick by stick, coin by coin. Don't waste it, don't rush it, and don't forget that wealth, like a good fire, don't grow on its own, it grows where you tended it. The cowboy spat into the fire, watching the hiss rise like a memory being put to rest. His voice carried the weight of men long gone, yet still alive through the tales he told. I reckon they folks think wealth a treasure chest sitting at the end of a hidden trail guarded by luck or destiny. But truth is, wealth more like a river. You don't find it at once, you step into it, you wade deeper, and if you keep steady, it carries you further than your legs could. And just like a river, if you don't respect its current, it'll sweep you under faster than you can holler. He tugged his hat lower, rain pattering gentle outside, then leaned closer to the flames. Take John, a lumber hand I met up north. Spent his younger years spending wages on whiskey and dice. By 30, he had nothing but calloused hands and debts thicker than pine bark. One winter, a blizzard near took his life, trapped him alone in a shack with nothing but a half sack of flour and time to think. When spring came, he swore he'd change. Every paycheck after that, he split 3 ways. One part for living, one for saving, one for investing. He didn't get rich quick, but by 50, he owned his own mill. By 60, he was employing boys half his age, paying fair wages, building something he once thought was impossible. Folks thought it a miracle. John taught it arithmetic. The old man let that sink in, then tapped his knee with his knuckles. Arithmetic, that what wealth boils down to. Add a little, subtract less, multiply your efforts, divide with wisdom. You don't need higher learning or fancy diplomas to master it. You just need the guts to keep at it when others quit. He shifted, eyes catching the glow of the fire. Now, you want to hear about irony? There was a banker I once knew, George, sharp suit, gold watch, voice slick oil, handled fortunes for men richer than most towns combined. Folks thought he was the wisest man in money. But George, he lived faster than his paycheck, never saving, always spending, drowning himself in luxury. When the markets turned sour one year, he lost it, had to sell his house, his horses, even that gold watch. Meanwhile, men who earned a tenth of what he did, but lived humbly and saved faithfully, whether where the storm met fine. George died bitter, still chasing the wealth he once held in his hands, but never truly owned. The cowboy laugh was low, a gravel shifting. See the lesson? Wealth don't favor the flashy, nor does it bow to pride. It bends to discipline, it a loyal servant to the man who respects it, and a cruel master to the fool who don't. A pause lingered in the firelight, flickered shadows across his worn boots. He drew a long breath. I reckon most men chase the wrong kind of wealth. They chase numbers on paper, carriages to ride, or land so wide they can't walk it in. But true wealth, real wealth, is measured in sleep. Can you lay your head down at night without worry gnawing at your bones? Can you wake knowing your family's secure, your work honest, your future brighter than your past? If you can, you're wealthier than kings who lie awake fearing tomorrow. The cowboy tilted his head back, staring into the dark rafters above. I seen miners cough their lungs black, dying rich but miserable. I seen farmers who never held more than a few acres live with smiles bigger than their barns. Ain't about how much you hold, it about how little fear you carry. Wealth is peace, and peace is the highest currency a man can earn. He rubbed his palm tail, letting the sparks fly. I'll tell you one last tale tonight. A fella named Henry, shoemaker in a dusty town where most folks barely scrape by. Every pair of boots he sold, he'd tuck a nickel away. Took years before those nickels became dollars, but he never stopped. Then one day, the railroad came through his town. Suddenly, travelers needed boots, workers needed shoes, soldiers needed leather. Henry expanded, hired apprentices, taught them his craft, and built a shop that outlasted him. His children inherited not just wealth, but a trade, a reputation, and a way of life. Henry didn't just make shoes, he made a foundation for generations. That wealth, that legacy. The cowboy let the silence return, rain soft whispers outside, fire dim but steady. His voice, when it came, was quieter, almost like a prayer. So remember, partner, don't chase wealth like it's running from you. Build it as you're planting seeds, water them with patience, guard them with discipline, and one day you'll sit by your own fire telling your own stories of how fortune found you, not in a rush, not in a gamble, but in the steady beat of honest work. The fire crackled, throwing out little bursts of warmth into the damp chill, while the cowboy leaned forward, elbows resting heavy on his knees. His voice took on that slow, deliberate tone, the kind that carried more weight than a ledger full of numbers. Now, there's something folks don't rightly talk about when it comes to money, the cost of greed. I've seen it chew men up faster than whiskey, faster than sickness, faster than loneliness. Greed a poison that tastes sweet at first sip, but it hollows a man out till he ain't nothing but skin stretching over bones of want. He poked at the fire with a stick, embers flaring in the dark. I knew a rancher once, name of Elias, hard-working, sharp with cattle, sharper with deals. By all accounts, he had enough by 40 to retire, to live easy and watch his children grow. But enough never tasted right to Elias. He kept buying more land, borrowing heavier, pressing his men harder. For a time, it looked like he'd carved himself a kingdom. But when drought came and the banks called in his debts, his kingdom turned to dust. Lost the land, lost the herds, lost the trust of the very men who'd built it with him. He ended his days working at a foreman for another ranch, bitter and go, muttering about how fortune betrayed him. But it wasn't fortune, it was his own hunger that undid him. The old man's eyes flickered with the reflection of flame. Greed is blind, it don't see tomorrow, it don't count risk. Discipline sees further. Discipline says, I'll stop pay. This is enough, the rest can wait. That's where peace comes from. Men think the secret from a trick or a loophole or a magic formula, but the truth is simpler. Know when to stop digging, for the hole swallows you whole. The rain outside thickened, drumming steady at the rhythm of time itself. He let it fill the silence before speaking there. Now, let me tell you about a woman, Clara, a seamstress in a dusty little town that folks weren't known for dreaming big. She stitched dresses by lantern light, saved pennies in a jar, and turned those pennies into bolts of cloth. Slowly, she hired girls from the neighborhood, teaching them the trade, showing them how to sew not just fabric but futures. Within 20 years, she had a factory with her name painted on the front, and she paid fair wages so no girl had to live the way she once did. People asked how she did it, thought maybe she'd struck a deal with luck, but she'd just lived by one rule. Don't spend what you ain't got, and don't stop until you're further today than you were yesterday. That's all.
He leaned back now.
Let out a breath heavy with memory. And you know what? Clara never called herself rich. Even when her name was on invoices across 3 counties, even when her sons rode fine horses and her daughters wore the kind of dresses she once owned mended, she'd just say, we're comfortable. That word comfortable is what wealth ought to mean. A roof that don't leak, a table with food, a bed that lets you sleep, and enough left over that tomorrow don't scare you. Anything more than that is shine. Shine don't last. The cowboy hand brushed against his boot, thumb rubbing the worn leather. A man asked us once, sitting right by a fire much like this one, what the hardest part of getting wealthy was. I told him plain and not the earning anyone with 2 hands and half a will can earn. It not the saving though that takes grit. The hardest part is saying no to spending when every neighbor flash a new hat, saying no to taking risks that promise the sky but hide the fall, saying no to the voice inside whispering just one more deal, just one more dollar. That the battle most men lose and they lose it in silence. The flames flared bright. He tossed in another log. I'll give you one last test to take with you tonight. Picture a man sitting on his porch, gay hair, eyes sharp, heart steady. He ain't got the most land, nor the most cattle, nor the biggest house. But he got a family that laughs sound his tale, a ledger that balances without worry, and neighbors who tip their hats with respect. That man ain't rich by the papers, but he wealthier than most kings. That the kind of wealth you can't measure with coin. That the kind you measure with years well lived. The cowboy fell quiet then, letting the fire pop and the rain carry the weight of his words. Finally, he gave a little nod like a preacher closing his sermon. So if you take anything from these rambling, take this wealth as less about chasing and more about choosing. Choose discipline over greed. Choose peace over pride. Choose enough over more. Do that, and someday you'll find yourself sitting calm by a fire, telling your own stories without regret. The storm rolled on outside, wind pushing against the cabin walls like a restless spirit. But inside the circle of firelight there was stillness, the kind that settled deep in a man's bones when the words being spoken carried truth. The cowboy drew a long breath, the smoke curling round his hat brim, and when he spoke again his tone carried the weight of both warning and promise. There was a miner once. Name of Saul, spent half his life in dark shafts digging for gold he never held. Every payday he'd spill his earned in the saloon, telling folks he'd strike it big tomorrow. Tomorrow stretched into decades, and when his back bent and lungs filled with dust, he had nothing to show for but those tomorrows. Now Saul weren't a fool. He knew how to swing a pick and sniff out a vein, but he never learned the lesson that gold you hold today worth more than the gold you dream of finding tomorrow. He traded real coin for smoke. The cowboy paused, squinting into the fire as if seeing Saul facing the embers. Truth is, two-mead men chase a windfall and lose the steady stream. Wealth ain't about striking it rich overnight. It's about letting drops fill a bucket day after day till you wake up one morning and find the bucket full. Saul never let his drops land. He kept kicking the bucket over, hoping for rain instead. He shifted in his chair, boots creaking on the wood floor. Now contrast that with Martha, a schoolteacher out in a dry town where the biggest excitement was the Sunday sermon. She didn't earn much, Lord knows, schoolmarms were never paid what they deserved, but she saved a dime from every dollar, bought herself a little plot, planted pecan trees that wouldn't bear for years. Folks laughed at her, said she'd never live to see 'em bloom, but Martha kept teaching, kept saving, kept planting. 30 years later, she had an orchard that not only fed her kin, but brought in steady coin from folks who'd once mocked her. While Saul was still dreaming of that one strike, Martha built her fortune root by root. That patience, that wealth. The cowboy let the fire fill the silence again, listening to the rain tap, tap, tapping on the roof. Then his voice softened, turning the edge of a worn coin. I reckon the real secret is, this money is a servant, not a master. Treat it like a master and it'll whip you bloody. Treat it like a servant and it'll build you barns, put shoes on your children, and carry you into old age without shame. But you gotta tell it that to go, else it'll wander off like a stray calf never to be found again. He leaned back, eyes catching the fire glow. I seen men ruin themselves by letting money lead them. They'd buy wagons they couldn't drive, horses they couldn't ride, and houses so big they echoed with loneliness. Yet I've seen men with half their coin sleep sounder because they knew how to make their money mind them. Truth is, peace don't come from how much you got. It comes from knowing what you need and not letting the rest trouble you. His words rolled slower now, each one like a log settling into the flames. I remember an old partner of mine, Luke, rode cattle drives together when we were young. Luke had a way with figures, always calculating, always scheming how to turn a dollar into two. One year he struck out on his own, borrowing heavy, to start a ranch bigger than his britches could hold. For a while, it looked like he'd done it. New barns, fine cow, big fences. But storms came, prices fell, and debt slid louder than his Cadillac did. Luke lost the spread, lost the stock, and near lost his sanity. Years later, I found him working at a hand again, skin leathered, pride broken. He told Luke, I should have stayed small. Should have grown with what I had instead of stretching for what I didn't. The cowboy hand tightened on the arm of his chair. That right there is the lesson. Grow slow, grow steady, and never let greed set your pace. Wealth that built too fast is like a fire in dry grass. It flares bright and dies cold, leaving nothing but ash. But wealth built slow, with patience and steady hands, that like oak logs on a hearth. It burns warm, it burns long, and it'll outlast the storm. The rain eased, softening against the roof, as though even the storm was listening. The cowboy gaze drifted far to no place memory kept alive. So if you find yourself at a crossroad, wondering whether to chase the quick dollar or stack the steady dime, think of Martha pecan trees. Think of the fire that burns long after the kindling is gone. Think of Luke, who reached too far and lost it all. Let those stories sit in your heart, a cold warming you against the chill of temptation. He lifted his hat, scratched his brow, then settled it back down. At the end of it, money, see in mirror. It don't change who you are, it just makes you more of it. If you're reckless, it'll magnify your ruin. If you're patient, it'll magnify your peace. The choice is yours and yours alone. Ain't no man, no market, no storm can change that truth. The lamp hot loud, sparks dancing up the chimney. The cowboy voice fell quiet again, like a hymn drawing to its last verse. Remember this, friend, wealth is the story you tell with your life. Make sure it one worth telling by the fire. When the years have carved your face and slowed your stride, make sure it a story without shame, without bitterness, without greed. The cowboy leaned forward, taking the stick and stirring the embers till sparks shot skyward like a handful of fireflies. His voice carried low and steady the kind of tone that made a man listen, whether he aimed to or not. There was another fella I recall, Ezekiel, though we just called him Zeke. Now Zeke weren't a man of but book learning, but he had eyes sharp bit of eagle and patience that could shame a stone. He worked a patch of land most men passed by, claiming it was too rocky, too barren to raise a crop. But Zeke, he knew the worth of what others ignored. He hauled rocks day after day, built fences from him, stacked walls, and turned the ground with mule and sweat. It weren't quick and it weren't easy, but year after year that land gave him something back. First it was meager corn barely waist high, beans thinning in rows, but Zeke stayed. By the 10th harvest his patch looked like Eden itself. Now what that teach a man? That opportunity don't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in places folk don't want to bend their backs. Wealth got an way of hiding so lazy eyes won't bother looking. Zeke proved you don't need the richest soil, just the strongest will. And when he was old and bent, sitting on that porch with grandkids running through fields he'd carved from stone, his neighbors finally admitted he'd seen something they never could. His wealth weren't in the crop or the coin. It was in the roots he'd set, the walls he'd built, the peace he earned by working the ground no one had believed in. The cowboy leaned back, eyes glimmering at the memory, then tipped his hat back far enough for the firelight to paint his weather-other face. Most men think wealth's something far off in banks or mines, in papers and stock tickers, but truth is it's closer than they relay. It in the way you rise with the dawn, do your work, and stack one honest day atop the next. It in refusing to spend $1 on vanity when that dollar could buy seed for tomorrow. It in choosing discipline when temptation whispers. Wealth ain't far away. It built from the ground you're already standing on if you've the grit to work it. The fire cracked, a log giving way and sending sparks dancing. The cowboy let the sound fill the room before speaking again. Take Clara, for instance, who was a widow with 3 children, and Lord knows she had every excuse to crumble. Her husband left nothing but debts, and creditors circled like vultures. But Clara, she didn't flinch. She baked bread, sold it to the town folk, saved every nickel she didn't need for flour and firewood. With kind, she bought herself a second oven, then a third. Hired help, built a bakery from nothing but grief and flour. By the time her children were grown, she not only paid every debt her husband left, but built a legacy her family still holds to this day. Clara wealth wasn't born of comfort, it was carved from hardship. That a kind of wealth that can't be stolen, cause it written deep in the character of a soul. The cowboy eyes softened, his words turning quiet, like the hush of rain on leaves. What ties these stories together is simple enough: patience, discipline, faith. Not the kind of faith that waits for miracles, but the kind that works a barren field till it blooms, bakes bread till it feeds a town, saves coins till they turn into orchards. The world will tempt you with quick riches, glittering promises that shine like fool gold in a pan. But quick riches vanish quicker than they come. But true wealth, the kind that lets you sleep sound, the kind that warms your family hearth long after you're gone, comes slow, steady, and honest. He tilted his head, listening, begged if the wind out was humming along. I reckon we're all storytellers in a way. Every dollar we earn, save, or spend adds a line to our tale. Some like tragedies, squandering what little they got. Some might epics of pride and downfall. But the wise, the truly wise, they write quiet stories of endurance. Stories their children can lean on, stories that etch in the bones of their kin like a well-played song. That the story worth telling, worth remembering. The cowboy reached for his tin cup, sipped slow, then let it rest heavy in his palm. So, friend, don't chase the mirage. Build your well where you stand. Fill it with steady labor, honest choices, and the kind of patience that don't rake under storms. One day, you'll sit by a fire like this, listening to the rain, and realize your wealth ain't just in the coins you stacked, but in the peace you earned while stacking them. The fire sighed low, coals glowing deep red, but though even the earth itself agreed, the cowboy let his words hang in the air a spell, that smoke twisting up into the rafters of a night sky. His eyes softened, carrying the weight of memories and the quiet pride of lessons well earned. There was another tale, he began, leaning his elbows on his knees, the firelight painting shadows across his weather-redder face. A young man named Elias, born with nothing but the clothes on his back and a will that could outlast winter itself. Folks said he'd never amount to much, too poor, too small a place in the world, but Elias didn't pay no mind to chatter. He carried himself with a stubborn sort of faith, the kind that don't rake when the road turns hard. The rain tapped against the tin roof, a rhythm steady as a drum, while his voice rolled along calm and certain. Elias started small, patching boots for the men at the mine. He learned quick that if you listen to folks not just with your ears but with your heart, they'll tell you what they truly need. Some needed boots patched, others needed soles replaced, and a few, why, they needed shoes altogether new. Elias took every dime he made and set it aside, never buying more than bread and beans for himself. Over time, he bought leather in bulk, tools sharper than four, and soon enough, he weren't just fixing boots, he was crafting them, sturdy, reliable, made for men who walked hard miles. Lee started small, patching boots for the men at the mine. He learned quick that if you listen to folks not just with your ears, but with your heart, they'll tell you what they truly need. Some needed boots patched, others needed soles replaced, and a few, why, they needed shoes altogether new. Elias took every dime he made and set it aside, never buying more than bread and beans for himself. Over time, he bought leather in bulk, tools sharper than four, and soon enough, he weren't just fixing boots, he was crafting them, sturdy, reliable, made for men who walked hard miles. Tooled him fair and honest, and word spread like spring water on thirsty ground. The cowboy tipped his hat back, watching the sparks swirl skyward. What Elias understood, and what so many forget, is that money grows when you grow something others can trust. He didn't chase fads, didn't paint his boots in fancy colors just to catch the eye. He built them to last, to serve, and in return, his name carried weight. By the time Elias was gay in his beard, his little shop had grown into a business stretching across counties. He never strutted nor bragged, just kept to his work, letting his boots walk the truth for him. And when he passed, his children inherited more than coin. They inherited reputation, honor, and a legacy built on trust. That wealth, truer than any banknote. The fire hissed, wood settling as if leaning into the story. The cowboy nodded slow, his tone drifting softer. See, the world will always whisper shortcuts in your ear, lotteries, quick trades, fast deals. But shortcuts cut you short. They strip away the lessons, the discipline, the backbone you earn only by riding the long trail. Elias knew that. Clara knew it. Zeke knew it. They prove that wealth is less about what you hold in your hands and more about what you carry in your spirit.
Patience, bed steady hand over too far. That never was. He leaned back, bones creaking against the old wooden chair, eyes catching the glow of the coals. Now, I ain't saying the path is easy. There'll be storms that flood the crops, debts that press the iron weights, days you'll feel like quitting. But it's those moments when the night feels longest that wealth is truly forged. Like steel and fire, a man's character hard dead in hardship. He once hardened, no thief, no storm, no twist of fate can rob him of what he built. The cowboy voice grew low, near a whisper, but it carried all the more power for its calm. I reckon if you're listening close tonight, you already know what you gotta do. Cut back the excess, sow steady seeds, be patient when the world rushes past. Wealth ain't built on hurry. It built with the dawn slow, certain, inevitable. He raised his tin cup, letting the firelight shimmer across the rim. So take heart, friend. Whatever rocky field you've been given, whatever hard soil you're standing on, work it with patience. Someday, the same folks who doubted you, see orchards growing where they swore nothing to bloom. That'll be your victory, quiet and steady as the rain on this roof.
And when you sit by your own fire, you'll understand wealth ain't about how much you live.
No matter how much peace you earned in the gathering, the cowboy felt silent, letting the night air and the hush of rain finish his thought, the story linger in late smoke, long after the words had faded. The cowboy took a long breath, the scent of wet earth drifting through the night. The fire cracked and hissed. His words rolled out steady with the ease of someone who's lived long enough to see truth repeat itself in many forms. Now, there a tale about a man named Hollis, he began, his gaze fixing on the embers glowing like tiny suns. Hollis weren't no scholar, nor was he a man with lead passed down from kin. He was a drifter, truth be told, wandering from one dusty town to the next, carrying nothing but a small sack and a harmonica that sung sweet in the quiet hours. But what set Hollis apart wasn't what he carried, it was what he made. Hollis paid mind to the small things most folks overlook. He had the eye to see where value lay buried, waiting to be uncovered. The rain slowed to a soft drizzle, and the cowboy toned deep and steady as a hymn. He found his first rake when he noted the general store tossing out sacks of grain that had torn open during shipment. Most folks saw waste rats pick pigs. Hollis saw feed. He vetted what was left, cleaned it up, and sold it to farmers for pennies on the dollar.
What little he made, he didn't squander, he saved it. Next trip to town, he did the same again. After months, he'd bathe enough to buy whole sacks at discount, then resell them to ranchers who didn't want the hassle of riding long miles to fetch their supplies. Before long, folks knew if they wanted feed, Hollis had it cheaper and closer than the big store in town. The cowboy tapped ash from his smoke, eyes narrowing though he could still see Hollis' ragged figure leaning against that wagon. But Hollis didn't stop there. He learned quick that if you serve one need, another need to show itself. Ranchers needed feed, but they also needed salt, blocks, rope, and tools that wore out quicker than a pair of boots in spring mud. Hollis used the money from grain to stock a few of those items, building trust with every deal. By the time he had enough to buy a wagon, he weren't a drifter no more. He was a supplier, riding the range with goods folks depended on. The cowboy voice softened, carrying the weight of the lesson. Hollis never struck it rich in a single day. He didn't stumble on gold or inherit silver. He built wealth like a man builds a fence, one post at a time, each one set firm for moving on. His secret weren't no secret at it. Notice what others waste, fix what others ignore, and serve what others fall short.
Do that long enough, and the world will lay its coin at your feet. The fire popped, shooting sparks into the night, and the cowboy leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath him. Now you might be wondering what happened when Hollis grew older, when the years slowed his stride. Well, by then he had 3 wagons, men riding for him, and a name that stretched farther than he had dreamed. He weren't Dent the drifter with a harmonica anymore. He was Hollis, the man who wrote goods to the people who needed him most. He built more than a business, he built reliability, and in that he found his fortune. And when he sat by his fire in the later years, he played that harmonica still, not for coin, but for peace, because he'd earned those. The cowboy gaze drifted skyward to where the clouds had started to rake and a few stars peeked through the wet haze. His tone softened into a near whisper, intimate and a prayer. Wealth ain't always stacks of paper or gold bars stacked in a vault. Sometimes it's a life where you ain't beholden to another man's hand. Sometimes it's the freedom to rest, knowing your work provided for you and yours. That's what Hollis found, freedom. And I reckon deep down that what we're all chasing. He leaned forward, poking at the coals of the stick, letting the glow rise up again. So when you find yourself fretting about what you ain't got, think of Hollis. Think of what can be made from scraps, what can be built from nothing but grit and patience. Think of how slow steps, steady and sure, will carry you farther than any gallop toward quick riches. For in the end, it ain't speed that wins the race, it's endurance. The man who lasts is the man who prospers. The cowboy fell quiet, the fire humming its soft tune, while the rain tapered off to silence. The lesson lingered heavy in the air, not spoken in haste, but carved deep like initials in oak. The cowboy cleared his throat, low and gravelly, like thunder rolling off faraway hills. Another tale come to mind, he said, staring into the faint glow where the coals still breathe. It about Clara, a widow who found herself facing more hardship than anyone's soul ought to bear. Her husband had been a mule skinner, tough and wiry, but when fever swept through the town, it carried him off and left Clara with nothing but 2 young children and a small patch of land, so rocky even weeds thought twice about sprouting. He leaned back, letting the chair creak, his voice drawing out the sorrow and hope of her story.
Most folks figured Clara would pack up and move in with kin, maybe beg her way through life on charity. But Clara, she had a stubborn streak. She weren't about to let misfortune write her fate. The cowboy word stretched slow, painted in the rhythm of a man who'd told such tales many times. At first, she struggled, trying to make that stubborn land give her something worth trading. She failed with corn, failed with beans, failed with near everything she planted. But instead of quitting, she looked closer. She nated wild herbs growing along the edges, plants most folks passed by without thought. Mint, yarrow, lavender, and sage. Clara did them, dried them, bundled them, and sold them to folks in town who prized their scent, their medicine, their comfort in teas and poultices. It weren't much at first, but it kept her children fed, and it taught her the power of looking where others don't. The cowboy smiled faintly, his teeth flashing in the dim light. Clara expanded slow. She fenced off a small garden, learned to grow the herbs with care, and started distilling oils with pots and jars her husband had left behind. She packaged them in bottles she scrubbed clean from the dump and sold them at the market. Her name grew not because she shouted the loudest, but because her goods worked. Her oils eased sore backs, her teas calmed troubled minds. Her herbs carried the smell of comfort into every home. And with every coin she earned, she didn't squander. She saved, reinvested, built something steady. The cowboy tone dropped low, carrying a kind of pride that only comes from admiring resilience. After a few years, Clara weren't just surviving, she was thriving. She bought better tools, hired a neighbor boy to help with the heavier chores, and built herself a small shop on Main Street. Folks said the moment you stepped inside, the air smelled like heaven's sweet lavender, crisp mint, warm sage. They came from miles just to breathe it in, and they left with jars and bundles, always coming back for more. He paused, watching the last of the sparks float up toward the black sky, then leaned closer as though letting the listener in on a secret. The real wealth Clara found weren't just the coin, it was independence. She didn't have to beg nor rely on nobody's mercy. She gave her children food, clothes, and even a proper education, all from them herbs she once saw as weeds.
To prove that what others ignore, a sharp mind and steady hands can turn into treasure. The cowboy voice softened to a near murmur, drawing the firelight in low. Clara's lesson is simple. There's a prayer. Don't curse the rocky ground you've been given. Search it, tend it, and see what grows. Don't envy the wide fields your neighbor owns. Find the value in your little patch, no matter how small. For wealth don't always come from wide acres or heavy pockets. Sometimes it grows quiet and steady in the overlooked corners of life, like herbs sprouting between stones. He tossed another stick into the fire, letting it crackle and spit. So, next time you think you ain't got much to work with, think of Clara. Remember how she turned weeds into bread, scent into coin, and hardship into freedom. That the kind of wealth that don't vanish easy, it rooted in ingenuity, discipline, and heart. And that kind of wealth, he said, leaning back to the rain-patterned soft again, is worth more than all the gold dust sifting from a river pan. The cowboy fell silent, letting the weight of Clara's story settle into the night air. The rain mingled with the fire hiss like a hymn humming soft in the dark, and the lesson lingered quiet, steady, undeniable. The cowboy leaned forward again. If the memory of Clara's triumph sparked another tale that needed telling.
His eyes reflected the firelight, and his voice carried that same slow drawl, worn smooth by years and by miles. Now, if Clara's story taught us about seeing value where others don't, then let me tell you about Emmett, he began. A drifter by most accounts, with boots more worn than the saddle he carried, and a reputation for bad luck gnawing him like a hungry dog. Folks say he couldn't hold a job nor keep a friend, but what they didn't see was the sharpness behind his quiet eyes. The cowboy spat into the fire, the hiss punctuating the moment. Emmett came into town with nothing more than a harmonica and a head full of numbers. Most thought he was just another wanderer playing tunes for a drink, but I remember one evening at the saloon. He sat at the corner table listening to the ranchers complain about how they never knew if the prices for cattle would rise or fall, how the markets back east seemed like a gamble stacked against them. Emmett didn't say much, just puffed a tune soft and sweet. But the next day he offered something unusual. He told those ranchers he could keep track of the market for him for a fee no larger than a couple coins each week. The cowboy chuckled. At first, they laughed. Who'd trust a drifter with their hard-earned coin? but one rancher, desperate and curious, gave him a chance. Emmett borrowed a corner of the telegraph office, spent hours reading the market cables and scribbling figures onto scraps of paper. He tracked trends, noted the rises and falls, and when the rancher followed his advice, he sold his cattle at the right moment. That vague trade earned him more than he'd made in 2 seasons of guesswork. Word spread fast. Soon, ranchers and traders alike were slipping Emmett coins to hear his predictions. The cowboy voice grew steady, more deliberate, now a genius of Emmett way. He didn't hoard his knowledge for quick gain. Instead, he built a system. He took the scraps of paper and turned them into ledgers, neat columns and rows that mapped out prices, supply, and demand. He started seeing patterns where others saw chaos. When he realized the power of what he held, he didn't squander it on drinking nor gambling. He charged fair, kept his head clear, and made sure his word held true. Folks came to respect him, not as a drifter, but as a man who could turn uncertainty into opportunity. The fire popped, sending sparks into the wet night air, and the cowboy leaned closer. Before long, Emmett had enough saved to rent himself a proper office. No longer was he hunched in the telegraph corner. He wore a clean shirt, polished his boots, and ran what folks began calling advisory bureau. He hired 2 boys to help copy records and keep books. His clients expanded from ranchers to shopkeepers, miners, and even the bankers who once looked down on him. Emmett built himself not just a business, but a reputation, and it came from listening when others weren't and trusting his knack for numbers. The cowboy voice softened, deepened, and a hemming carried low. But the true success weren't measured yet in coin. Emmett built something no one could take: respect, dignity, and a life far removed from the days when folks dismissed him as a vagrant. He taught that knowledge, when sharpened, disciplined, and shared, could be a man's most powerful currency, and he showed that opportunity often hides in the complaints of others, waiting for someone keen enough to listen. The cowboy sat back, letting the rhythm of rain against the cabin roof fill the silence. So what Emmett lessened, he asked softly, though he already knew the answer, that even if the world sees you in nothing, if you got a skill, whether it numbers, words, or working with your hands, you can shape it into something valuable. You can carve out a place for yourself no matter how small you start. Wealth ain't always found in land or cattle. Sometimes it in seeing what others ignore and having the grit to shape it into a future. The cowboy let the thought linger, the fire glow reflecting in his eyes like embers that refused to die. The lesson hung in the air, clear, simple, powerful as steady the rain that kept on falling through the endless night. The cowboy shifted in his chair, the creak of old wood cutting through the steady patter of rain on the roof. His gaze wandered past the fire. He had seen not the flames, but the ghosts of men long gone. "Now, I told you about Emmett," he murmured, voice deep to the earth itself. "But there another tale sitting heavy on my heart. A fella named Jonas. Folks called him Jonas the Mule, not 'cause he was stubborn, though Lord knows he was, but 'cause he carried burdens heavier than most men could bear. He wasn't born into much, and what little his family had was gone before he was grown, but Jonas had one thing money couldn't buy, a patience that could outlast the desert sun." The cowboy leaned close to the fire, poking at a log until sparks rose high. Jonas worked wherever he could, digging ditches, hauling rock, clearing brush. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure didn't pay much, but every time he earned a coin, he tucked away half. Folks mocked him for living lean, for wearing boots that flapped at the soles, for eating beans when others splurged on steak. But Jonas weren't counting comfort, he was counting opportunity. He paused, letting the storm outside fill the silence before continuing. One winter, a railroad company came through looking for men to help lay track. The pay was better than Jonas had seen. Though the work was back-breaking, he signed on, kept his head down, and saved near every dollar. While others spent their wages at saloons or sending money back home, Jonas stored his away in a tin box buried beneath the floorboards of his shack. By the time the rail stretched clean across the county, Jonas had more saved than most men would see in a lifetime of labor. The cowboy voice took on a rhythm, the kind that rose and fell like the crackle of firewood. But Jonas didn't stop there. He knew money sitting idle was like a mule tied to a post. It had strength but no purpose, so he started small. He bought a wagon, then another, hiring men to haul goods between towns that the railroad couldn't reach. He knew the rail brought supplies quick, but it was the wagon men who delivered it to the farms and mines scattered across the hills. Jonas saw the gap, stepped into it, and before long he had a line of wagons moving like ants across the countryside. The cowboy smiled faintly, though it carried the weight of reverence. Folks didn't laugh at Jonas no more. They called him a visionary. Though all he really did was see what others ignored, he took his savings, rolled it into land near the new station, built himself a warehouse, then another.
His wagons kept moving, his business kept growing, and that patience young Wham each storm. And that patience paid him back a hundredfold. Where others sought quick pleasure, Jonas built slow, steady wealth. He didn't chase glory, he chased purpose. And purpose, in time, made him rich beyond reckoning. The cowboy leaned back, chair legs thudding soft against the floor. But him the part worth remembering, he said low, voice carrying the weight of truth. Jonas never forgot what it meant to haul burdens. He paid his men fair, gave them food when times were lean, and helped their families when sickness came calling. He knew wealth weren't just about keeping more, it was about doing more, about being the kind of man whose fortune made the world a touch lighter for those who carried heavy loads. The rain softened, and if listened, and the cowboy let the words settle like dust on old trail boots. Jonas the mule, he whispered, eyes glinting in the glow. A man who turned patience into prosperity. And ain't that a lesson worth holding close? Wealth built slow lasts longer, and the richest men are those who ooh their gain to ease the burden of others.
The fire popped again, a bright crack in the quiet night. The cowboy drew a slow breath. He was pulling the weight of Jonas' story into his own chest before letting it drift out in the smoke.
The cowboy rubbed his weathered hairs in her neck ball. You know, question this baby, we had let it drift out on the smoke. The cowboy rubbed his weathered hair hands tabs, letting the heat of the fire soak deep into bones that had known too many cold nights. His eyes flickered with something, not sadness, not joy, but a quiet respect for men whose stories weren't often told. Jonas' tale drifted far, he said in a near whisper. It got me thinking how the road to wealth don't always come with fanfare or the thunder of hooves. Sometimes it creeps along like a mule on a rocky trail, steady and unshaken. That the kind of road Jonas walked, and it led him farther than he had dreamed. He shifted, boots scratching against the floorboards. Now I'll tell you about something most folks never knew. Jonas, after his wagons and warehouses turned profit, didn't go throwing gold on like confetti at a fair. He bought time. Time, you see, is those precious coin we've got. He stopped breaking his back at sunup and instead set his mind to learning. He'd sit by lantern light, reading old books on trade, markets, even law. Some thought it strange what a mule driver need with learning.
Frankly,
Jonas knew something they didn't knowledge was the plow that cuts the deepest furrow. The cowboy chuckled low, a sound that gravel spilling from a bucket. He didn't learn for himself. He gathered the young men in town who wanted more than bare survival, sitting with them in that warehouse when the day work was done. He showed them how to save, how to reckon numbers, how to see opportunity where others only saw hardship. Those boys grew into men who built shops, stables, even banks. A whole community shifted, because one mule of a man decided to pass on what he'd learned. The fire hissed and rain slid down the chimney stone, but the cowboy voice stayed steady. Now, Jonas had one test he gave every fellow who came asking for advice. He'd hand them $1 and say, spend it if you want, but if you come back tomorrow with something that makes that dollar work for you, then I'll teach you more. Most bought candy, whiskey, or cards, and Jonas never scolded them for it. But a handful came back with seeds, tools, or scraps they turned into something useful. Those were the ones Jonas poured his wisdom into. He didn't waste his time on fools. He planted it in the soil of hungry minds. Cowboy leaned forward, his face etched by firelight like a canyon wall. At the secret right there.
Rock, baby.
Wealth ain't the stack of coins on your tail. It's what you build in others. Jonas' fortune didn't lie only in land or wagons. It lay in the men and women who grew stronger because of his teaching. And that kind of fortune, it don't rust, it don't rot, and no thief can carry it off in the night. Silent stretches, filled only even by the hum of the storm beyond the cabin wall. The cowboy voice softened to near a hum but the rain itself, so when you sit there listening, maybe you're thinking about your own road. Maybe you're wondering how to climb from the mud to the mountain. Don't look for shortcuts or silver bullets. Look for patience. Look for discipline. Look for the chance to learn and pass it along. 'Cause money fades quick if it don't have roots. But the kind of wealth Jonas built, slow, steady, shared, that the kind of wealth that'll outlast even the stone of this old cabin.
The cowboy let the words fall into the crackle of the fire. They burned slow and deep. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just sat with the memory of a man who had carried burdens heavier than gold and turned them into a legacy worth more than treasure. Outside, the storm rolled softer, as though the heavens themselves were listening, nodding in quiet agreement. The cowboy stretched his legs towards the fire, the leather of his boots creaking in the heat.
Dwight kick on that soft, gravelly drawl that made the storm out sound more a hymn than a threat. Now, Jonas wasn't no saint. He was flesh and blood like the rest of us, prone to temper and stubborn, a bull. There were times he lost money, bad deals that near broke him. But to the truth, most men don't stomach well failure the fee you pay for wisdom. Jonas didn't cry over spilled ledgers. He picked them up, shook out the ashes, and started writing fresh. That what made him different from the lot who quit when the first gust of wind blew hard. The cowboy hand drifted to the brim of his hat, tugging it low, and shading his eyes from memories. I recall a tale told by one of his apprentices. There was a shipment of grain Jonas invested in, meant to feed half the county through a hard winter. Storms tore the wagons apart, left sacks rotting in the mud. Any other man would have folded. Jonas did the scraps, dried what he could, and instead of feeding it to men, he fed it to livestock. Come spring, those cattle were fat and fetching higher prices than the grain it would have brought. He turned disaster into prosperity with nothing but grit and the refusal to waste. The cowboy chuckled, shaking his head slow. That's the kind of lesson that sticks like a burr. Don't mourn what you lose, shape it into something new.
Grellstone bowed to the wind, bends and grows around him, poked at the fire with an iron rod. Sparks jumping fireflies against the cabin dark walls. Folks asked, what did Jonas do with all that wealth? Did he build mansions, wear silks, throw banquets? Not hardly. He built barns, schools, and bridges. He fixed roads so wagons wouldn't sink. Axle deep every spring. He paid teachers with coin from his own purse till the town had enough strength to carry him proper. That's the difference between a man who rich and a man who wealthy. The rich clutch their gold like a miser. The wealthy spread it to seed, knowing the harvest comes back tenfold in ways corn alone can't measure. The cowboy gaze drifted to the window where rain streaked the glass, glowing faint in the firelight. And it wasn't that about money. Jonas made time his friend. He'd wake before dawn not to toil, but to sit with his coffee, reckon the day ahead, and breathe in the stillness. He believed a man who can't master his own morning can't master his life. Folks laughed at him for sitting quiet while chores piled up, but when they saw how calm his hand stayed in crisis, they stopped laughing. That's how he led, with stillness, not noise. The cowboy voice slowed, heavy with meaning. When the years caught up with him, Jonas didn't fear death. He knew he built something that wouldn't crumble.
Ledgers would fade, his barns would weather, but the minds he trained, the habits he sowed, those would live on long after his bones turned to dust. And sure enough, when the town begged for his funeral, it wasn't him. It was the whole county. Men who owned shops, women who ran schools, children who never known hunger, because Jonas taught their fathers how to keep grain dry. That was his real fortune. The cowboy leaned back, letting silence take hold, the fire humming like an old fiddle. So when you sit by your own fire, wondering how to make something of yourself, remember Jonas. Remember the mule driver who bought time with sweat, turned loss into lessons, and planted his wealth in people instead of pockets. That the kind of story worth carrying on the trail, whispered from one campfire to the next. The storm had quieted now, a soft drizzle tapping against the cabin roof, like the world itself was settling into slumber. The cowboy didn't say more, just tipped his hat, letting the lesson hang in the air, warm and heavy as smoke. The cowboy stirred the embers with a stick, watching the glow flare and fade like the rhythm of breading.
His voice was low, almost a murmur, and as he were letting the tail roll out, purple foam in the brain. Now, it'd be easy to call Jonas lucky, but luck's just a word folks use when they don't see the hours behind the man's hand.
Jonas kept a notebook, small and leather bound, with pages filled edge to edge. Not numbers, not ledgers, but thoughts. Every mistake he made, he wrote down with the same patience he gave his victories. He believed memory was fickle, but ink was eternal. That little book became his compass. When a deal smelled sour, he'd flip through pages and find the ghost of a past failure warning him. More than once, that book saved him from losing his shirt. The cowboy smiled faintly, lifting his chin toward the rafters. They're a story of a banker from the city, all polished shoes and sharp words. He tried to swindle Jonas on a loan, presenting fine print so tangled most men would have signed away their freedom without knowing. Jonas sat there quiet, turning pages in his notebook. After an hour, he closed it slow and said, "Son, I've already met your kind 10 years Eve, wore a different hat, but carried the same tricks." He pushed the papers back, never raising his voice. The banker left red-faced, and Jonas' men never found themselves shackled to debts they couldn't climb out of. The cowboy leaned closer to the fire, the heat reflecting in his eyes. What folks don't grasp is that wealth ain't built on a single victory. It a chain, every link forged by a lesson. Jonas made peace with failure, but he never let it pass without leaving a scar he could study later. That's how you build resilience thicker than oak. The rain picked up again, steady, drumming on the roof like a slow march. The cowboy tilted his hat back, his voice growing thoughtful. Jonas all had a gift for listening. Men in town thought they were wise because they could talk Turks around each other. Jonas sat in silence, letting them wear themselves out. Then, with a single question, he'd cut straight to the heart. That patience, listening more than speaking, made folks trust him. Trust is a currency no bank can mint, yet it worth more than gold. That's why his barns were full when others were empty, why neighbors would ride through a storm just to lend him a hand. The cowboy rubbed his jaw, stubble catching the firelight. He even taught his children to say. His eldest boy once came back from market, proud of rooster because he'd talked a farmer down to half the price on seed. Jonas didn't smile. He asked, did the man walk away happy? The boy frowned, confused. He entered in. Bill, the banker, left red-faced, and Jonas' men never found themselves shackled to debts they couldn't climb out of. The cowboy leaned closer to the fire, the heat reflecting in his eyes. What folks don't grasp is that wealth ain't built on a single victory. It a chain, every link forged by a lesson. Jonas made peace with failure, but he never let it pass without leaving a scar he could study later. That's how you build resilience thicker than oak. The rain picked up again, steady, drumming on the roof like a slow march. The cowboy tilted his hat back, his voice growing thoughtful. Jonas all had a gift for listening. Men in town thought they were wise because they could talk Turks around each other. Jonas sat in silence, letting them wear themselves out. Then, with a single question, he'd cut straight to the heart. That patience, listening more than speaking, made folks trust him. Trust is a currency no bank can mint, yet it worth more than gold. That's why his barns were full when others were empty, why neighbors would ride through a storm just to lend him a hand. The cowboy rubbed his jaw, stubble catching the firelight. He even taught his children the same. His eldest boy once came back from market, proud of rooster because he'd talked a farmer down to half the price on seed. Jonas didn't smile. He asked, did the man walk away happy? The boy frowned, confused.
Right, really.
Break it down. Cowboy, man. Cat's later. He builds wealth the way of blacksmith and steel. It's like science, gold and peak. Each trial made him stronger. He enjoyed sharper. By the end, he wasn't just a man with a coin in the bank. He was the kind of man whose name meant safety in a storm, whose word weighed heavier than contracts. Outside somehow, rise off their road, soft and distant. The storm wandering off into the hills. The cowboy let out a breath, slow and steady. That's why I keep telling these stories by the fire. Not to glorify a man, but to remind you wealth is born of patience, respect, and a steady hand to learn when the world kicks you down. Remember, Jonas, when you think the night too dark, he proved you can rise from nothing so long and you've got the will to listen, learn, and keep riding forward. The flames cracks and it sparks into the chimney.
The cowboy tipped his hat, eyes half closed, as if listening to the echo of his own words in the rain. The silence stretched, heavy but warm, like a blanket pulled tight against the chill. The cowboy voice carried steady, smooth as a river after the rains, the firelight drawing shadows across the lines of his face. Jonas wasn't that fighting battles with bankers and markets. He was fighting himself, too. You see, greed a beast that'll eat you alive if you let it. Plenty of men made their fortunes quick, only to lose them quicker because they never knew when to stop. Jonas had this way about him, a compass inside that pointed toward balance. When the harvest came in better than expected, he didn't rush to buy more land or wagons he couldn't tow. He set them aside, tucked the rest into what folks today call investments. But his kind of investments weren't fancy. He'd put coin into a neighbor's sawmill or back a blacksmith who needed better tools. He knew if they prospered, the whole town prospered, and his own fortune grew right alongside theirs. The cowboy leaned back on his chair, the wood creaking under the shift of his weight, eyes watching the smoke twist up to the rafters. There's a story I recollect, one of those moments that shows a man true grit.
Right, really.
Like one winter colder than most, with snow so deep you'd swear the earth itself was hiding.
A traveling merchant wagon broke down near Jonas' land, and the thing The man had nothing but busted wheels and frozen hands, looking more like a ghost than a traitor.
Yeah, most folks would have sent him along, saying they couldn't spare nothing for a stranger in times like that. But Jonas didn't blink. Had the wagon fixed, brought the man inside, gave him stew and fire, and when spring thawed the land, that same merchant repaid him in ways no ledger could measure.
He brought word of Jonas' name far and wide, and soon buyers from towns over sought him out, not just for goods, but for trust. The rain had quieted to a drizzle, soft the whispers on the cabin roof, and the cowboy tone softened with it.
It weren't always easy, mind you. Jonas had days that the walls closed in, with failure weight pressed like an anvil on his chest. He lost deals, he lost friends, he even lost faith in himself once or twice. But he had this saying, storms don't last, but a man's choices do. He'd walk the fields in silence, boots crunching frost or sinking mud, reminding himself the earth always came back, after being torn by plow or frozen by cold. That gave him patience.
Patience enough to wait out the worst of times, to see past the moment and into the horizon. The cowboy poked at the fire, sending sparks up in a burst, before they faded. What makes Jonah's story worth telling isn't that he ended rich, it's that he ended respected. His barns weren't meant full of grain, but of people gratitude. When a widow couldn't pay for seed, he'd tell her, plant it and we'll settle after harvest. When a drifter needed a day work, Jonas would hand him a shovel, no questions asked. The man understood money was a tool, not a crown. Because he treated it that way, it never ruled him. The cowboy shifted, leaning closer to the fire, voice dropping lower, more intimate. I reckon that a lesson worth carving into stone, wealth without wisdom is a curse. You can pile gold high enough to block out the sun, but if you ain't got peace in your soul, you'll never sleep sound. Jonas slept fine most nights, not because his bed was soft, because his conscience was. That a kind of wealth no thief can steal. The flames swayed gentle, casting a golden hue that danced with the rain's silver reflection on the window pane. The cowboy let out a long breath, thumb running along the brim of his hat. So when you sit to listening to this old voice, think on what Jonas left behind. It weren't the coins, nor the acres of field.
Realizing that a man can rise by lifting others. You measure fortune not in what you hold, but in how steady you stand when the storm rolls in. That the wealth worth dreaming of by a fire like this, the cabin creaked in the wind, as if the wood itself nodded along with the words. Outside, the night stretched endless, but inside, the warmth of the tale made it feel like morning might yet be around the corner. The cowboy by eyes softened, catching the glow of the fire one last time before falling quiet, letting the lesson hang in the air like smoke, heavy but clear. The fire popped with a sharp crack, and the cowboy gave a slow nod, although the flames themselves had confirmed his tale. Now, I ain't saying Jonas was a saint. No man is. He had his temper, his pride, and moments where the weight of envy nearly broke him. There were times he'd see another rancher with more cattle, or a trader with wagons full of silks and spices, and he'd feel that itch inside, the one that whispers, why not me? But instead of letting it fester, he'd turn that envy into fuel. He'd ask himself what work he hadn't yet done, what risks he hadn't yet considered, and then he'd take steady steps, not leaps.
Try really not a quake. You can't have a win. Can't sway.
The toy grew slow and sure, like a tree that bends with the wind instead of snapping under it. The rain picked up again, drumming harder against the roof, and the cowboy voice took on a rhythm to match it. This memory I hold close. One I reckon explains Jonas better than any ledger could. He once told a young boy neighbor's son, bright-eyed but restless, that money like a river. If you dam it up, son, Jonas said, you'll drown in your own hoard. But if you let it flow, guide it smart, it'll water fields far beyond your own. And when those fields bloom, you'll find yourself with more than you started. That boy grew up to run one of the largest mills in 3 counties, always remembering Jonas' words. He never hoarded, never let greed rot his bones. Instead, he let his success spill over to others, just as Jonas had taught him. The cowboy leaned forward, his weather hands hovering over the flames, though warming them on the memory itself. Jonas' wealth didn't come from schemes or trickery. It came from persistence. He'd wake before the rooster crowed, spend his daylight laboring and his nights thinking. He'd read whatever scraps of books he could get, ledgers on trade, writings on law, even old philosophy texts that most folks would have tossed in the fire for kindling. He wasn't just building wealth, he was building himself.
For a man who knows numbers, but not people, is poor in the ways that count. Jonas made sure he'd never let that happen. The flames hissed and slogs split, sparks fluttering like fireflies before vanishing into the dark. The cowboy brigades followed them for a spell. Folks today might call it strategy. Back then, we just hit sense. Jonas didn't scatter his gold across every shiny opportunity. He chose what mattered. He bought sturdy wagons instead of flashy ones, good tools instead of ornaments, and always kept a little set aside for the unexpected. Because life full of storms, broken harvests, sudden sickness, markets crashing overnight, and only a fool thinks he can outwit fate without preparing. Jonas knew better. He respected fate, but he never let it scare him still. The cowboy voice softened, almost like he was speaking to himself. There came a time when Jonas' name carried further than he walked. Traders from other towns spoke of him. Men in cities mentioned his fairness in deals, and even those who envied him couldn't help but admire him. But Jonas never strutted, never bragged.
Thought tip his hat, get back to work and remind folks that the real measure of a man ain't in what folks say when he's alive, but in what they remember when he's gone. The rain slowed and the night seemed to pause. Holding its breath as the cowboy leaned back, his chair creaking in the hush, Jonas left behind more than wealth. He left behind a way of seeing the world. One where hard work and kindness weren't opposites, but partners. One where a man could be both strong and fair, both ambitious and humble. That a rare balance, rarer than gold in them hills, and if you ask me, it's the kind of balance worth chasing. The cowboy eyes lingered on the fire, flames reflecting in their tired depths. So, if you find yourself wondering what kind of wealth worth pursuing, remember, Jonas, remember that coins tarnish, barns fall, and fields dry up, but the way you live, the choices you make, the people you lift, that's the kind of fortune that echoes long after your boots stop walking the earth. He fell silent then, letting the fire do the talking, the soft crackle and hiss like a lullaby against the storm-dying whispers. Outside, the rain left the world washed clean, and inside, the cowboy's story left the air thick with a lesson carved deeper than words. The cowboy gave a low whistle, almost like he was summoning a memory from the shadows.
Lied straight on the fire. His words wandered far, drifting like smoke, keep quiet. There was a season when Jonas nearly lost it in. Bad harvests rolled in one after another. Storms knocked out roads so wagons couldn't pass, and men he trusted defaulted on their debts. Any lesser man might have thrown in his hands, cursed the skies, and sunk into bitterness. But Jonas, he carried on, step by steady step. He didn't waste his nights on worry or his mornings on anger. He'd sit at his table, candle flickering, and he'd redraw his plans, line by line. If a road closed, he'd say, then I'll cut a new path through the woods. If a crop fails, I'll plant what grows hard time. There's always something that'll take root. If you're patient enough to find it, the cowboy voice took on a steady cadence, the sort of rhythm that fit with the soft rain still tapping on the cabin roof. Now patience, that was Jonas' greatest weapon. He knew fortune don't smile on demand. He cut slow, a gimper's catching on damp wood, and only if you tended careful. I remember him once refusing a quick deal that promised double returns in a fortnight. Neighbors laughed at him, called him foolish for passing it by. But when that scheme collapsed, when every man who bought into it lost near everything, Jonas stood firm. His barns weren't bursting with gold, no, but his roof didn't cave either.
Right, Billy. Like it. He can't tackle. It's a chance like better named Billy Jim.
But you discovered turn out to nag his knowledge than he will. Sometimes surviving a storm is the real victory. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the air, and the cowboy leaned forward, his face lit with a somber glow.
Place of ask what the secret to wealth. They expect that trick. It's a shortcut. Jonas proved it ain't a trick at all. Did 1,000 small choices stacked one atop another day after day. It resisting the urge to grab fast gains. It's saying no when greed whispers yes. It doing honest work when no one watching wealth built on steady ground stands, while castles built on sand wash away in the first tide. The cowboy paused, listening to the logs settle, the sound of bones shifting under the earth. You want another truth about Jonas? He never walked his road alone. He lifted others along the way. When neighbors couldn't afford seed, he'd lend without interest, saying if your crop grows, pay you later. If it fails, we'll both try again. And fun it then, folks paid him back more often than not because they had to, but because they wanted to. His trust in them became their trust in him. And trust, well, that a kind of currency more valuable than any coin. The cowboy gaze softened, the edges of his voice fraying with memory toward the end of his years. Jonas didn't spend much time counting his coins. He spent it sitting by the save fire where he'd once dreamed his first dreams.
Try pretty. My children would gather at his knee. Listening, he told them the kind of stories that didn't come from ledgers, but from life. He'd tell them that wealth weren't about having more than the next man. It was about knowing you had enough and using it to leave something behind. And when he passed, those children, grown into men and women, carried his lessons like torches into their own lives. And the cowboy stretched, his chair creaking under the weight of time. The fire dimmed, burning lower now, but its glow still wrapped the room in warmth. Jonah's story ain't just one of riches, it's one of resilience, patience, and generosity. It's a reminder that wealth ain't measured in how heavy your pockets hang, but in how steady your soul stands when trials come. The night outside was quiet now, the storm passed, the earth cleansed. The cowboy gave one last nod to the flames, and though thanking them for their company, his voice, soft and near to a whisper, closed the story. So when you think on Jonas, don't think on numbers. Think on the way he lived, the choices he made, the hearts he touched. That the kind of fortune no storm can wash away, no thief can steal, and no death can diminish. That the kind of fortune a man ought to chase. The cowboy leaned back, letting silence settle, thick and easy. The only sound the faint hiss of rain-soaked wood giving up its last bit of smoke. The story lingered, heavy with the scent of wet earth, timeless sends the stars beyond the cabin roof. The cowboy shifted in his chair, pulling his coat tighter though the fire still burned steady. Now be a thing about Jonas that stuck with thee, he murmured, his voice low and rough, guy gravel rolling in a stream. He weren't a man who let pride get in his way. Plenty of fellas around these parts thought they knew better, strutting about with their schemes, puffing their chests. But Jonas, he listened. If a farmhand had an idea, he'd hear him out. If an old-timer spoke of a method long forgotten, he'd give it a try. He understood that wisdom don't just sit at the top of a ledger. It seeps in from all corners, from young and old alike, and in listening, he found things others overlooked. Better ways to plant, smarter ways to trade, fairer ways to deal. The cowboy leaned forward, hands spread toward the embers, palms glowing with reflected light. One time, when the river flooded and washed out the road, traders all panicked, couldn't get their goods to town, couldn't move stock. Jonas, he hitched up rafts and floated his grain downstream. Folks laughed when he first tried it, said he'd lose it all in the current, but when he rolled in the market, damp sacks still full, and the shelves bare from other shortages, he sold out for sundown. That, what I mean, where others saw failure, he saw a turn in the trail, a way round the rain out began din, light and steady, tapping the roof like fingers drumming a lullaby. The cowboy words softened with it. He also knew the worth of rest. Strange thing to mention in a tale about wealth, but it matters. Jonas worked hard, no doubt, but he also rested right. He'd stop at sundown, light his lantern, sit with his wife, talk with his children. He didn't let the hunger for more swallow him whole. And that balance, that steady walk twixt labor and life, kept him sane, kept him sharp. While others burned themselves out, Jonas endured. He leaned back, eyes catching the glow of coals that burned deep and red. There a lesson there for every man dreaming of fortune. Gold might glitter, but it don't tuck you in at night. A ledger might balance, but it won't laugh with you at supper. If you got his money, then all you'll hold is emptiness, cold and shallow. Jonas knew better. He built wealth that he built his home, strong beams, steady stones, and room enough for others. The cowboy voice grew slower, each word a deliberate step. On a long road in his later years, folks came to him not for loans or bargains, but for counsel. Young men asking how to start, old men asking how to endure, widows asking how to hold on, and Jonas gave them time. Never brushed him off. That too was part of his fortune. He had time to give, and that, my friend, is the rarest wealth of all. The fire shifted, logs collapsing inward, a burst of sparks rising before sinking back into quiet red. The cowboy tilted his hat down, speaking softer now. Lucky was settling into the end of the tale. So heed what I reckon. If you chase after Jonas' kind of wealth, you won't find it in gold dust or promises of quick return. You'll find it in patience, in listening, in taking care of your own and those around you. You'll find it in the long nights you keep your word and the early mornings you try again. And one day, when you're gay and your hands are tired, you'll look around and see not just what you built, but who you built it with that wealth. The kind that don't fade, The cowboy let out a slow sigh, the sound mingling with the hiss of the fire. The storm outside seemed to ease, the rain softening into a whisper. For a long moment he sat silent, only the flicker of flames playing across his weather face. Then he spoke once more, quiet as the embers, steady as the earth beneath. Jonas left behind more than coin. He left behind a way of walking through this world. And maybe if you walk it too, you'll find yourself richer than you dreamed. The fire dwindled, shadows stretching long across the cabin walls. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, the weight of memory still heavy in his chest, but his eyes soft, content with the story laid bare. The cowboy shifted again, the chair creaking beneath him, and he reached for the tin cup beside the fire, taking a slow sip before settling back into his tale. His voice rolled like thunder low on the horizon, steady and warm. Now, don't go thinking Jonas' trail was all straight and smooth. Nah, life don't hand no man a road without ruts. There was a time his storehouse burned down, flames licking high into the night, taking with it years of careful stockpiling, neighbors there whispering how that'd be the end of him. But Jonas, he just stood there watching, quiet like, not shouting, not cursing the sky. And when the ashes cooled, he sifted through what remained, salvaged what he could, then set his jaw and started again. Folks said it was stubbornness. I reckon it was faith that what he'd built once he could build again. And he did, bigger than before. The cowboy set the cup down slow, eyes fixed on the firelight. See, most men let that define him, but Jonas, he let it refine him. Every setback carved him sharper, stronger, like steel tempered in flame. Where another man would rake, he'd bend, and then spring back straighter than that. That's why people trusted him. They knew he weren't a fair-weather success. He was tested, scarred, and still standing tall. The rain outside picked up, pattering on the roof, wind sighing through the trees. The cowboy words seemed to ride the rhythm of the storm. One lesson he taught without even trying was the worth of patience. Young men would come asking how quick they could get rich, eyes burning with hunger. Jonas never raised his voice, never scolded, just told them the truth. Quick money, a fire and dry grass, bright, hot, but gone before you can cook your supper. He'd tell them to think like a farmer, planting seeds, tending steady, trusting the harvest to come in its time. Some laughed, walking away to chase a scheme, but those who listened, those who put in the years, they're the ones whose children still live well today. The cowboy leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His shadow stretched long behind him, dancing in the firelight. Jonas all believed in keeping his word above all. A man's promise was worth more than coin to him. There was a story about a deal he struck with a trader who later tried to back out, realizing the bargain weren't in his favor. Jonas could have pressed, could have forced it legal-like, but he didn't. Let the man walk free of it, saying only a deal lives if both sides stand easy in it. Now, N said that was foolish, letting profit slip away. But it weren't foolish when, years later, that same trader sent business his way. Business that set Jonas ahead for decades. Integrity might not buy supper right away, but it'll feed your cave for a lifetime. The cowboy tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest, the rhythm steady at his words. When he grew older, Jonas passed down not just his coin, but his ways. He'd sit with his sons, his daughters too, teaching them to read accounts by lantern light, to weigh fairness with profit, to judge a man's character before his handshake. He didn't just leave him money to spend, he left them wisdom to keep. That's why, long after he was gone, his kin thrived, not squandering away what he built, but growing it, each generation stronger than the last. The wind moaned against the shutters, and the cowboy voice softened with it. And hand the part that gets it, friend. Jonas weren't no legend in his own eyes. He saw himself as a simple man doing his best, raising his family, working his land, dealing fair. But to those around him, he was proof that wealth ain't just numbers written in ink. It's a legacy of how you live, how you treat others, how you endure the storm. That's the pint of fortune that don't fade with time. The cowboy leaned back once more, drawing a long breath, the firelight painting his face in gold and shadow. So when you sit by your own fire, wondering if the road worth it, remember, Jonas, remember that storms will come, fires will burn, folk will doubt you, but if you hold steady, if you build fair and true, you'll leave behind more than riches. You'll leave behind a trail worth following. The fire popped, a shower of sparks leaping up before drifting back down to ash. The cowboy watched them fade, his eyes steady, his voice slow in the night itself. That the tale plainly I can tell it, wealth ain't a finish line. It'll walk step by step through wind and rain, sun and shadow, and if you walk it right, one day folks will gather round a fire, speaking your name the way I speak Jonas now. The cabin grew quiet again. Save for the rain and the low crackle of the fire, the cowboy tale lingered, that smoke hanging in the air, warm and heavy, a lesson carried in every flicker of flame. The cowboy let the silence hang for a spell, the kind of quiet that seeps into your bones and makes you feel the weight of what's been spoken. His fingers brushed the brim of his weather hat, pushing it back just enough for the firelight to catch his eyes. They gleamed dark with pride, but with the sort of calm a man carries when he's seen life compassed and still found peace sitting by a flame. Now he said low, "Don't go thinking Jonas' way was easy." Plenty of folks scoffed at him, thought him slow, thought him old-fashioned. They were chasing fortunes, like tumbleweeds in the wind blowing fast, scattering further than they could follow. But Jonas, he planted himself deep, like an oak tree. And you know what happens when storms blow through? The weeds get carried away, but the oak still stands. The rain drummed harder overhead, almost as if the sky itself nodded along. I reckon that the trouble these days, the cowboy went on, his tone steady but edged with thought. Folks want the glitter of gold without the patience of polishing it. They don't see that wealth earned slow is wealth that sticks. Jonas never needed to boast or flaunt. His riches weren't hanging from his neck or parked out front. They were in his land, his trade, his word, and his kin. That the kind of wealth you don't measure in coins, but in peace of mind when you lay your head down at night. He leaned forward, stirring the fire with a stick, watching the sparks climb. There was a time a stranger came through town, trying to peddle a miracle scheme, quick riches, easy profit, all wrapped up in slick words. Half the young men were dazzled, ready to hand over what little they had. But Jonas, he stood quiet till the man was done, then asked the one question. If your fortune's so sure, why you selling it to us instead of sitting rich yourself? The room went still, and that peddler's smile faded fast. Folks saw the truth plain as day. It weren't anger or scorn that exposed him, just simple wisdom from a man who knew that real wealth don't need no salesman. The cowboy voice softened, drawing the listener closer without needing to shout. And that another thing, Jonas carried clarity. He saw through noise, through lies, through temptation, not because he was clever with tricks, because he held to simple principles. If something sounded too good to be true, he stepped back. If a deal asked him to trade his soul for silver, he turned away. He measured every opportunity by one thing, but it let him sleep easy, knowing he harmed no man and cheated none. That compass never steered him wrong. He leaned back again, letting the stick fall into the flames, eyes watching the embers burn it down. Funny thing is, Jonas never kept a ledger of all his lessons. They weren't writ in ink, they were carved in the way he lived, the choices he made when no one was watching. And somehow, those around him learned just by seeing it. His neighbors grew steady, his children wiser, his friends more loyal, all because one man chose the harder path of patience and honor. Outside, thunder rumbled distant, rolling across the hills like a reminder of storms yet to come. The cowboy voice carried that same steady roll. In the end, Jonas proved something most folk forget. Fortune don't come from chasing, it comes from tending, like a campfire. You don't make it blaze by grabbing every spark that flies. You keep it alive by feeding it steady, watching the flame, giving it time. Do that, and it'll warm you through every cold night. The cowboy paused, his gaze holding steady on the listener, as if weighing whether they'd take the words to heart. Then, with a slow nod, he settled deeper into his chair. So, friend, when you walk your road, don't fret the quick shine or the loud talkers. Build quiet, build honest, and build for the long haul. One day, you'll find you ain't just rich, you're wealthy in ways no coin can buy. The fire crackled loud then, a log shifting and sending sparks up into the rafters, light flickering across the cabin walls. The cowboy let the sound fill the space, his words hanging in the air like smoke, heavy and warm. The cowboy let the fire ease into a low, steady glow, his words spilling out slow as molasses, like he was more talking to the flames than to you. Now, I ain't telling you Jonas' story 'cause it's rare. Truth is, men like him are out there, still quiet souls building something steady, while the world runs itself ragged, chasing shadows. But most folks don't notice him, 'cause wisdom don't shout. It whispers. We've all gotten mighty poor at listening. Lean back, boots creaking against the floorboards, his eyes glinting in the half-dark. There was a winner. Rough a bare hide when prices on there everything went sky high. Neighbors panicked. Rushed to spend all credit, trying to grab what they could before it slipped further out of reach. Jonas, though, he sat still, waited, tightened his belt, and said, storms don't last forever. A man who saves his seed through the frost gets to plant come spring. And sure enough, when the thaw came and folks were broke from spending dear money on dear goods, Jonas had his savings, still bought what he needed at half the cost. And when the land came ready, he planted double. By autumn, his harvest wasn't just good, it was plentiful enough to feed others who'd gone hungry from their haste. The cowboy drew in a long breath, holding it, letting the rain rhythm patter against the cabin roof. That a lesson worth of, and not all hunger is for food. Some folk are starving for peace, for security, for the feeling that tomorrow won't knock the ground out from under 'em. Money spent reckless can't buy that. But patience, foresight, and steady hands will grow you a feast in due time. He tilted his head, as if listening to the old memory right in the storm. I recall another tale of Jonas. A younger man came to him once, all fired up with a scheme, wanted Jonas to lend him a pile of coin so he could strike it big in a venture across the border. Promised him riches triple did in a season. Now Jonas, he didn't laugh at him, didn't scold, he just asked for details. Who was running the venture? How were the risks weighed? What would the lad do if it went south? The young man, he couldn't answer proper. All he had was the gleam of hope, not the bones of a day. Jonas patted his shoulder gentle and said, dreams without reckoning are like horses without bridles. They'll run you into a ditch quicker than you can blink. That boy walked away sore at first, but years later, when the venture went bust and swallowed every coin from those who joined, he came back to Jonas, said those words saved him from ruin. Sometimes wisdom don't feel light in the moment, but it's the kindest gift a man can give. The cowboy chuckled low, soft the embers glowing at his feet. See, what Jonas knew is that wealth ain't about numbers in a book, it's about choices in the quiet. Do you spend or do you save? Do you chase or do you build? Do you gamble or do you plant? A man's fortune grows from the sum of those answers day after day, year after year. While others fret over the luck of the draw, Jonas never needed luck. He had discipline, and that was stronger than any hand of cards. He reached for his mug, sipping what little coffee was left, the steam curling in the dim light. And let me tell you something else. Jonas never lived as a miser. He wasn't afraid to enjoy what he had, but he knew the line between joy and waste. He'd mend a coat rather than toss it, but he'd buy good boots, 'cause good boots carried a man further. He'd eat simple, but he'd share generously when company came. His philosophy was simple: spend where it multiplies value, not what it dwindles. That a rule most folk could stand to learn. Even now, the storm out softened, rain falling lighter, wind humming low. The cowboy let the sound fill the pause, then tapped the table once with his knuckle. Jonah's story ain't just about money. It about a man refusing to be ruled by fear or greed. It about choosing the slow path, knowing it leads somewhere sure. And that, my friend, is the kind of success worth chasing. One you can sit by the fire with, looking back without regret. The cowboy tipped his hat down over his brow, leaning back though the night itself was tucking him into silence. But even in the hush, the weight of his words lingered, warm by the glow of the coals, steady of the rain against the wood. The cowboy stirred the embers with a stick, watching sparks leap and fade into the rafters. His voice carried that slow drawl of a man who'd seen more winters than he cared to count. Now, if folks hear stories like Jonas and reckon it all about denying yourself, never enjoying the fruit of your labor, but that ain't the truth. Jonas didn't hoard that a miser clutching gold under the floorboards. He understood balance. There was a season for saving, a season for spending, and most importantly, a season for giving. He set the stick aside, hands folded easy in his lap. See, wealth has a way of rotting if it just sits in one place too long. Like water gone stagnant, it breeds bitterness, envy, even sickness. But when a man lets it flow carefully, wisely, it nourishes more than just himself. That what Jonas grasped better than most. His barns weren't full of grain, they were full of goodwill, and that, more than coin or cattle, was what gave him peace. The cowboy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes catching the dim glow of the fire. I remember a winter when sickness swept the valley. Families couldn't work, couldn't trade, supplies were thin, and panic whispered through the hills. Jonas didn't wait for folks to beg. He loaded his wagon with sacks of flour, jars of beans, firewood cut and split, and went house to house. Some tried to pay him right then, offering what little they had, but he waved it off. Said, "You may be back when the earth lets you stand tall again. Until then, you keep your pride and your strength." And most of them did pay him back years later in work or harvest or kindness returned. But even if they hadn't, Jonas would have counted it fair, because he believed wealth hoarded in times of need was wealth wasted. The rain outside deepened, thunder rumbling somewhere far, like a reminder of storms yet to pass. The cowboy voice softened, carrying a note of reverence. There was a man in town, bitter old coffee grounds, who used to mock Jonas, called him foolish for lending without paper, without signatures or law to bind a soul. That man guarded his money like a wolf guarding bones, never gave, never lent, never trusted. But you know what? When sickness hit his own house, his coin couldn't keep death from the door. And in his grief he found himself standing at Jonas' gate, asking for help. And Jonas, he didn't turn him away. He gave just as freely as he had to anyone else. That moment changed that man forever. He learned that money ain't worth a damn without the heart to do it well. The cowboy shifted, boots scuffing the wood floor. Now, let me tell you what all this boils down to. Wealth a tool, no more, no less. In the wrong hands, it becomes a chain, weighing a man down with worry, greed, and fear. In the right hands, it becomes a lantern lighting paths, not just for the one who holds it, but for those walking beside him. Jonas carried his wealth like a lantern. That's why people trusted him, why his name carried weight even when his pockets didn't jingle loud. He let out a low laugh, raspy but warm. A lantern don't burn forever, but while it burns, it keeps the dark from swallowing folks whole. That the kind of legacy worth leaving. He reached for the kettle, poured the last of the coffee into his tin cup, and let the steam rise slow. So you see, money itself don't make a man rich. It's what he does with it when no one watching that matters. Jonas chose to see wealth in something alive, something meant to grow, to circulate, to nourish. And I have a bet even when his coin ran low, his influence never did. Folks knew him as a man who steadied others when the wind howled hardest. The cowboy paused, staring into the fire like it held the truth of every word. That's success, not chasing fortune, but letting fortune find its way through you, leaving the world better lit than it was before. The storm rhythm slowed, the rain now gentle against the cabin walls. The cowboy sighed, long and low, setting his cup down with a quiet clink. Jonas never cared for monuments, never carved his name in stone. But every soul he helped, every child who went to bed full cause of his kindness, that was his monument. And it stands taller than marble ever could. He leaned back, the chair creaking, and let the silence settle deep, like the weight of a lesson well learned. The cowboy rubbed his hands together, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his bones, and his voice took on that steady cadence again, like hooves hitting packed dirt in rhythm. See, Jonas understood that true wealth weren't measured in numbers on a ledger, nor in how many acres you could fence off. It was measured in the strength of the hands you lifted, the comfort you spread, and the kind of peace you left behind when you weren't around no more. That's why his story sits so deep in my memory. Lived simple, but his impact stretched farther than most men dream of. You would notice how he was saved behind piles of riches, but no one sheds a tear when they're gone. And then there are others like Jonas, who leave behind little more than a pocket knife, a worn hat, and a memory that carries on in 100 different homes. That wealth you can't lock in a safe. The cowboy eyes flickered to the shadows playing on the walls. Funny thing is, Jonas never once boasted about his ways. He never preached from a pulpit, nor wagged a finger at men who did different. He just lived his truth, day after day, quiet and steady. That's what made people pay attention. They saw the results, fields that thrived, families that survived, towns that pulled through hard winters, and they knew it weren't luck. It was discipline mixed with kindness, the sort of alchemy that turns coin into something far more valuable. Folks began to imitate him, not because he told them to, but because his way showed itself stronger than greed it could. The cowboy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice dropping softer, of confident in the listener. Jonas used to say, a man's pockets can be full and his soul empty, or his pockets can be lean and his soul overflowing. Which one do you reckon folks remember? He lived by that creed. Even when fortune took a turn, when droughts came, when markets dipped, he stayed generous. Never reckless, mind you, but generous. They're a difference. A fool throws his last coin to the wind. A wise man knows how to hold steady while still sharing enough to keep others from sinking. Rain tapped harder for a moment, though the heavens themselves nodded agreement. The cowboy voice picked up, steady via trail song. Now wealth management, that what the city men like to call it nowadays, Jonas just called it common sense. Spend less than you earn, invest in what grows, protect against storms, and never forget the neighbor struggling down the road. That was his four-part creed, though he'd never put it in thin words. If by living that way he built not just a fortune, but a network of loyalty that no coin could buy. You reckon that worth something? I tell you it is. When the barn roof caved in, when sickness knocked him down, it weren't his savings account that lifted him. It was the people he'd lifted for years. They came with hammers, soup, and prayers, paying back in time. That's how a man becomes truly wealthy, not by his own strength alone, but by the strength he shared so freely that it comes back to him tenfold. The cowboy exhaled slowly, letting the steam of his breath mingle with the campfire smoke. Some might say that sight of life don't fit in today's world of tickers, indexes, and apps that trade while you sleep. But I'll tell you something, truth don't change. Tools change, names change, but truth don't. Discipline, generosity, foresight, and humility, they're in timeless as the hills. A man today with stocks and bonds who lives the Jonas will outlast one who gambles with greed. Mark my words, you don't have to be sitting on a porch in worn boots to live this way. You could be staring at a screen in a high-rise. The principles still hold, like steel under rust. The cowboy fell silent for a spell, listening to the fire crackle, then lifted his gaze with that look of remembrance, far off, that close to the heart. What I hope you carry from this tale ain't the details of Jonah's fortune or the tally of his deeds, it's the rhythm of his life. Simple, steady, generous, like a song hummed under your breath that keeps you walking when the road stretches on longer than you thought. That song, that what makes a man wealthy. And when the world grows cold, like it surely does from time to time, that song warms more than one soul.
Got the cowboy exit with a little about that riches to begin, only the courage to walk that path. The cowboy leaned back, his silhouette framed against the glowing embers, voice low and steady as he was pouring wisdom straight into the quiet. Now, I ain't telling you this story so you'll think Jonas was a mighty saint. He weren't flawless, no man is. He had his temper, his stubborn streak, times when he near lost everything by holding too tight to his way of doing things. But what set him apart wasn't that he never stumbled, it was that every time he did, he got back up wiser. He'd dust off his boots, tip his hat to the lesson, and carry on without complaining. But another kind of wealth most men overlook, the wealth of experience. Every misstep, every mistake, if handled right, becomes an investment that pays out in wisdom. Trouble is, most folks cash out too early. They give up before the lesson been earned. The cowboy stirred the fire with a stick, watching sparks shoot up into the dark at tiny stars. Jonas used to reckon that life handed out two kinds of currency, coin and time. You could spend coin foolishly and still earn more, but once time spent it gone. That's why he measured his decisions more by time than money. He'd ask, will this cost me days I can't get back?
Or give me more to live with thank on that a while, and you'll see how powerful it is. Wealth built on coin alone can be fragile, but wealth built on time well used can't be taken away. Even in his old age, Jonas could sit by the fire with peace in his eyes, because he knew he hadn't squandered what was truly scarce. The rain outside softened, the rhythm turning to a gentle patter, and the cowboy tone warmed, like a man remembering a friend with fondness. He was clever about investments too, but not in the way bankers speak of them. He invested in folks. When a neighbor needed a loan, he offered it, sometimes in coin, sometimes in labor. When a child showed promise, he'd scrape together enough for their schooling. He figured that kind of wealth was slow growing, like planting oaks. You don't sit there watching every inch. No, you let them take root. And one day, when you ain't even thinking about it, you find yourself resting under shade you didn't know you were growing. That's what happened with Jonas. Years down the line, the folks he'd helped became the very ones who kept his legacy alive. His wealth multiplied, not in ledgers, but in lives changed. The cowboy eyes narrowed, studying the flames as though seeing something deep inside him. You might think, well, that's just kindness. Where's the strategy? But kindness, my friend, is strategy if you've got the patience to see it through. Jonas proved it. Folks trusted him more than they trusted banks or contracts, because they knew his word was bond. That trust gave him opportunities. No man chasing greed. Test. Doors open for him. Deals favored him. Storms passed easier, because he'd already built goodwill that money alone can't buy. That is truth, sure's old as the hills. Wealth built on trust grows steady, while wealth built on fear crumbles quick. He paused, letting the fire crackle, fill the silence, then spoke again, softer now, like he was speaking right into your chest. I reckon the finest thing Jonas left behind was peace. Peace in the hearts of those who knew him. Peace in his own soul when he laid down for the last time. You can't put a price tag on that. You can chase all the fortunes you want, stack bills till they scrape the rafters, but if you ain't got peace, you're poorer than the leanest man alive. Jonas knew that, and he lived it till his final breath. And when folks knelt by his grave, they didn't speak of his balance sheets or his assets. They spoke of his steadiness, his generosity, his laugh that could cut through the darkest night. That, right there, was the true wealth. The cowboy leaned forward, poking at the coals, his voice steady as the rain outside. So if you're listening and you're wondering how to grow rich without losing yourself, take a page from Jonas' life. Live steady, spend careful. Invest in folks, value your time above all else, and never forget, peace ain't something you buy at the end. It's something you earn along the way. You do that and you'll find yourself sitting by a fire one day, knowing you've built a fortune no storm can touch, that the kind of wealth worth dreaming about. The cowboy sat quiet for a spell, letting the fire sail into a bed of steady embers, glowing low but fierce, the kind of heat that lasts longer than the flash of flame. His voice, when it returned, was unhurried, like he was taking care to weigh every word before setting it loose into the night. They're a thing most folks don't cotton to until it's nearly too late. Wealth, true wealth, aims at the gathering of dollars and cents, at the gathering of moments worth living. Jonas knew that. He weren't perfect, not by a long shot, but he carried himself like a man who understood that each day was a coin dropped in the jar of life. Spend it carelessly, and it rattles on empty. Spend it wise, and it buys you memories that shine brighter than any silver. The rain on the roof shifted, lightening up into a slow drizzle, the kind that lulls a body into thinking. Jonas used to sit out on his porch come sundown. The cowboy went on, watching the sky fold itself into twilight. He'd sip his coffee slow, thinking over what had been earned and lost that day. He told you once that every man ought to take stock a day and not in dollars, but in peace. Because peace, he said, is the only currency you carry across the river when your time comes. Ain't no vaults where you're headed, only reckoning with how you lived and whether you tended to your spirit the careful understock. The cowboy tilted his hat back, his eyes catching the reflection of the coals. What struck me most about Jonas was how he could look a storm in the eye and not flinch. Lost a harvest one year, near lost his home another, but he never lost himself. Said storms were just reminders from the Almighty that a man ain't in charge of all things, only the choices he makes in the midst of trouble. And trouble, he reckoned, was a test of character. You can curse it, or you can learn from it. Jonas always chose the latter. Every setback became a stone he laid down on the path that led him forward. That type of resilience, my friend, is rarer than gold, and twice say valuable. The cowboy stretched his legs towards the fire, boots catching the glow, and his tone softened into something near reverent. He taught to something else, too, that wealth grows best when shared. A man hoarding coin is a tree refusing to drop its seeds. He might look mighty for a while, but he won't leave no forest behind. Jonas gave freely, and yet his purse never seemed lighter for it. Strange thing, generosity. It multiplies even when it looks like subtraction. Why, when Jonas passed, folks didn't measure him by what he left in his accounts. They measured him by the shade he'd planted, the hands he'd lifted, the peace he'd left behind in others' hearts. That the kind of balance sheet no banker drafts, but it's the only one that counts in the end. The cowboy leaned forward, voice low and steady now, carrying the weight of truth. So if you're listening by this fire, ask yourself, what kind of wealth are you building? Is it the kind that can be tallied in numbers, or the kind that can be felt in silence? Jonas chose the latter, and though the world may forget the figures of his end, they'll never forget the ilk of his kindness. That, right there, is what it means to live rich. The flames flickered, the night growing still, and for a long while, the cowboy just stared into the glow, as though he could see Jonas sitting there, still quiet, steady and unshaken, a man whose wealth had outlasted him. And maybe in a way, it had. The cowboy cleared his throat, as he was setting down another stone on the long trail of memory. His words came slow, each one deliberate, like the sparks drifting skyward from the embers. Now, I reckon most folks figure wealth is something that lives in the future, some grand prize waiting at the end of a hard road. But Jonas, he taught that it don't rightly work that way. Wealth is built in the present, one honest choice at a time, like stacking firewood for winter. You don't wait for the cold to set in before you start chopping. You work steady, day by day, until you got a pile high enough to keep your family warm when the frost comes. Same goes for building a life worth living. The rain drummed softer on the cabin roof, like a gentle hand tapping out rhythm, steady at a heartbeat. Jonas weren't flashy with his means, didn't drive no shiny rig, didn't wear no gold watch, but he owned something far rarer contentment. He'd say a man who knows enough is richer than a man who always wanted more. That stuck with it, 'cause I've seen plenty of folks with fat wallets but empty souls. They chase after the next shiny thing, but the truth is, if your heart always hungry, no treasure'll fill it. Jonas fed his heart with simpler meals, quiet mornings, honest labor, laughter shared around supper. Those were his riches, and they never ran dry. The cowboy shifted, the firelight catching the lines of his face, each crease like a chapter written by wind and time. I remember the winter he near lost it in. Crops failed, cattle got sick, debts piled high. Most men would have folded, but Jonas didn't. He tightened his belt, sold what he could, and leaned into grit instead of despair. He told her then, loss ain't the end of a man unless he lets it be. It's just a season, and seasons change. And sure enough, spring came, grass grew back, and Jonas rebuilt. That resilience, that refusal to bow to circumstance, that was his true fortune. Gold can be stolen, land can be taken, but a spirit that don't rake, that unassailable. The cowboy leaned forward, poking the fire with a stick till sparks leapt into the dark. And then something folk don't often see. Jonas didn't measure success by the comfort of his own chair, but by how many others found rest around his table. I can't count the number of drifters, widows, and lost souls who found a meal and a kind word under his roof. He never sent nobody away hungry. You might think that drain a man, but it seemed to fill him instead. Like every loaf he broke multiplied something inside him. Funny thing, generosity, it don't deplete, it deep pit. And the folks he helped, well, they carried his name in their prayers long after they left his porch. That kind of wealth echoes, far beyond the reach of coin. The cowboy voice softened, near raking into reverence. See, Jonas understood that money's a tool, like a hammer. It can build or it can break, depending on the hand that wields it. But wisdom is what teaches a man how to swing that hammer right. Without it, riches can ruin faster than they can raise. With it, even the smallest means can build something mighty. Jonas left this world without fanfare, no headlines, no monuments, but he left behind something more enduring, a legacy of kindness, grit, and quiet joy. And I reckon that the truest wealth there is. The fire cracked, sending a spray of sparks into the night, and the cowboy leaned back in, letting the silence stretch. Outside, the drizzle had near stopped, leaving the air fresh, sharp, and clean, like the world had been washed anew. You take nothing else from his story, he murmured, his tone low and final. Take this riches fade, but character carries. A man who tends his heart like a well-tended fire will never be cold, no matter how dark the night. He tipped his hat, innocent salute to the memory of Jonas, then let the night take back the quiet. The cowboy sat still for a cell, letting the quiet of the night wrap round him like an old blanket. His eyes wandered toward the tree line, where the shadows of pine and oak stood like silent sentinels keeping watch. Oh, he said, his voice hushed but firm. There's something folks don't often reckon with. Wealth ain't but numbers in a ledger or coin stacked high. It's memory. It's the stories you leave behind sitting the embers in other folks' hearts. Jonas, he never aimed for riches that glittered in daylight. He aimed for riches that glowed in the dark, like the trust of a neighbor or the steady hand of a friend who knows you'll show up when it counts. That currency, too, though it don't jingle in a pocket but fire pop, throwing sparks skyward, little bursts of light swallowed by the vast black sky. I'll tell you, the cowboy continued, I've walked through towns where money flowed like spring rivers, but the air smelled of loneliness. Then I've wandered through places poorer than a mule feed sack, yet laughter rolled through their streets like music. The difference weren't the weight of their purses, but the measure of their hearts. Jonas knew that well. He'd trade coin for time, trade comfort for connection, trade easy roads for the hard paths that led to something lasting. But every choice built him a fortune most men never think to count. Shifted, boots scraping the wooden floorboards of the porch, the sound grounding his words in the stillness. One winter I remember, Jonas had dead enough grain torn to keep his family fed. Times were lean all across the valley. A neighbor come knocking, kids starving, hope near gone. Jonas didn't think twice. He opened his granary and shared what little he had. I asked him after, "And you worried your own will go hungry?" He just smiled, that calm smile of his, and said, "If a man hoards in fear, his soul stars quicker than his stomach. But if he gives, Providence finds a way." And wouldn't you know it, a week later a wagon from the next county rolled in with surplus looking to trade. Jonas then filled back up, almost like the Lord himself was saying, "You did right, son." The cowboy chuckled low, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. Funny how it works, ain't it? The more you grip something, the quicker it slips through your fingers. But when you let go, when you share, it circles back multiplied. Jonas lived by that truth, and it made him wealthier than any banker in town, though you'd never know it from the plain coat on his back. His gaze returned to the fire, flames licking the night air, dancing like restless spirits. "But don't mistake me," he said, his voice firm iron nails. Jonas weren't soft. Worked harder than 3 men put together. Before the rooster crowed, he was up. Long after the last light in town went dark, he was still mending fences, checking stock, planning the next season. He didn't hand out what he hadn't earned. That another piece folks forget. Generosity without discipline is just folly. Jonas balanced both the grit to earn and the grace to give. And that balance, that steady stride between effort and kindness, was the backbone of his fortune. The wind picked up, whistling low through the branches, carrying the scent of wet earth. I reckon that the lesson most folks overlook, he went on. They chase wealth like it in far-off mountain peak, thinking they'll only find peace when they get there. But peace don't wait at the summit. It's built along the trail, in the sweat, in the pauses, in the moments you choose right, even when no one looking. Jonas built his peace day by day until it stood taller than any hill or coin. And when the storms came, and they surely did, his foundation held firm. He weren't just surviving, he was prospering, even in the lean years, because his wealth weren't bound by barns or banks. Was bound by character. The cowboy leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath his weight, eyes glimmering in the glow of firelight. "That's the kind of story I aim to carry forward," he whispered. "Not the tale of a man who chased and grabbed, but the tale of one who planted and nurtured. His legacy don't shine like gold, it burns steady like this fire. And I reckon, if a man can leave behind a flame that keeps others warm after he gone, well, that's the finest treasure there is." The fire burned lower, logs collapsing into a bed of coals, glowing steady and sure. The cowboy felt quiet again, leaving the night to cradle his words, each syllable hanging in the damp, cool air like a promise carved into time. The night stretched on, a long black ribbon stitched with silver stars, and the cowboy voice carried soft and steady like the drawl of a river making its way through canyon stone. See, Jonas never once mistook noise for wisdom. World full of folks running their mouths about schemes, get-rich-quick tricks, and added glittering nonsense that fades faster than smoke on a windy night. But Jonas, he kept his words measured, his promises steady. If he told you he'd be there come sunrise with a wagon full of lumber, you could bet your boots you'd hear those wheels crunching gravel at dawn. That type of reliability.
Oh, see, on my gear, that the color of thing on the chair creep beneath his weight, eyes glittering in the glow of firelight. The coolest story I aim to carry forward, he whispered. Not the tale of a man who chased and grabbed, but the tale of one who planted and nurtured. His legacy don't shine like gold, it burns steady like this fire. And I reckon if a man can leave behind a flame that keeps others warm after he gone, well, let the finest treasure there is. The fire burned lower, logs collapsing into a bed of coals, glowing steady and sure. The cowboy felt quiet again, leaving the night to cradle his words, each syllable hanging in the damp, cool air like a promise carved into time. The night stretched on, a long black ribbon stitched with silver stars, and the cowboy voice carried soft and steady like the drawl of a river making its way through canyon stone. See, Jonas never once mistook noise for wisdom. World full of folks running their mouths about schemes, get-rich-quick tricks, and added glittering nonsense that fades faster than smoke on a windy night. But Jonas, he kept his words measured, his promises steady. If he told you he'd be there come sunrise with a wagon full of lumber, you could bet your boots you'd hear those wheels crunching gravel at dawn. That type of reliability. Worth more than a gold vein deep in the Rockies. The cowboy shifted, pulling his coat tighter against the chill, though the fire still gave off its steady warmth. Funny thing about wealth built honest, it spreads without a man even trying. Jonas' reputation, that was currency in itself. Doors opened, not cause he demanded it, but because folks knew he carried the weight of truth. You wanted a loan from the bank, they'd ask if Jonas vouched for you. You wanted a partner in the trade, they'd say if Jonas trusts him, I do too. Now tell they what coin spins smoother than trust, what vault deeper than a good man word.
That the kind of fortune that don't rust, don't rot, don't slip away with the market tides. The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the dark, and his eyes narrowed on the coals. I reckon Jonas saw money the way a farmer sees rain. Useful, necessary, even precious, but never yours to command. You store too much of it. The ground dries and cracks, you waste it, the crops wither. But tend it wise, spread it where it counts, and it brings life, growth, abundance. That how he handled every dollar, every deal like a steward, not a slave. Served his wealth, and in turn it served him back, steady cheese in the seasons. The cowboy hand moved, palm open, hovering jet above the fire, letting the heat seep into his skin. There was a time he took a gamble, though not with dice, not with cards, but with courage. He pooled what little savings he had to buy out a sawmill that had been left for dead. Folks laughed at him, said he was wasting good money on rotten boards and rusted gears. But Jonas, he didn't see ruins. He saw potential. Spent weeks cleaning the place, months fixing machinery, nights falling asleep on a cot by the furnace just to get it running. Come spring, that mill wasn't just standing, it was humming like a hive. By the end of the year, every builder from 3 counties hauled their timber there. The same folks who mocked him were lined up at his door, begging for work or supplies. That's what I mean by wealth built on vision, not on luck, not on chance, but on the kind of grit that makes tomorrow bend in your favor. The cowboy paused, looking out past the trees where the night pressed thick, as if listening to echoes only he could hear. And I'll tell you something, Jonas didn't keep all that profit to himself. Sure, he took care of his own, made certain his children had boots that fit and meals that filled their bellies, but the rest, he invested it back into the town. Built a schoolhouse when the old one was falling apart, fixed the bridge after a flood carried half of it downstream, even set up a little fund so widows and orphans had something to lean on. That's the kind of wealth most men never consider. Not stacks of coin, but the chance to lift others so they ain't drowned by the same storms you already weathered. The cowboy chair creaked as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low but heavy with conviction. You want to know why Jonas' story matters even now, sitting around a fire all these years later? Because he proved something to me. Forget riches ain't in what you keep, but in what you give away without losing yourself. Wealth is when you can look a man in the eye, knowing you've done right by him, and he'll tip his hat with gratitude rather than spite. Wealth is when your name carries weight, not because of fear, but because of respect. That a treasure chest, the rave can't bury, a ledger death can't balance, the cowboy lets silence fall. Only the hiss of embers filling the space, so when folks ask me how to chase fortune, I tell them plain stop chasing, start building. Build trust, build discipline, build something that'll outlive the dust of your bones. Money will come and go, always has, always will. But character, generosity, vision, those are eternal currencies. Jonas knew it, lived it, and left it behind at the lantern, still burning for the rest of us to follow. And if a man listens close, he can still hear that light whispering through the dark. Don't waste your life counting coin when you could be counting lives changed. The fire burned low, coals glowing like old rubies at the heart of the pit. The cowboy leaned back, eyes half closed, the rhythm of his voice trailing into the still night. That wealth, partner, you could carry even a fraction of it with you. Well, you've struck a vein richer than any gold rush or found. The night deepened, clouds slidden over the moon like a curtain drawn shut, and the cowboy voice seemed to wrap tight around the fire, thick with that low rumble of memory and meaning. Jonas' wealth, it wasn't just timber or land or gold. It was the kind that stitched a man into the very fabric of his community. You see, while others spent their fortunes trying to make their names bigger, Jonas poured his into making other folks' lives steadier. And there's something powerful in that, partner, something you can't weigh or measure in no bank ledger. The cowboy reached down, poking at the fire with a branch until sparks flew upward, scattering like tiny stars. One winter, heavy snows came early, caught the whole valley unprepared. Folks ran out of firewood, cattle starved. Families sat in cabins with frost creeping through the boards. Jonas didn't stay cozy by his own hearth. No, sir. He hitched his team, loaded wagons full of logs, and went door to door, leaving wood on porches without a word. Didn't ask for thanks, didn't even stick round to see who knowed. By the thaw, everyone knew whose generosity had kept half the valley alive. And you know what? Come spring, when the mill needed extra hands, there was not a man in town who wouldn't show up at dawn, hat in hand, ready to swing an axe or haul a beam. That wealth to loyalty earned not by demand, but by kindness freely given. His voice dropped, softer now, almost like he was speaking to the shadows more than the listener. Truth is, Jonas understood a principle most men never get their heads around. Money like a horse, restless, wild, eager to run off if you don't know how to handle the reins. Chase it too hard and you'll wear yourself to the bone. Let it run without discipline and it'll buck you into the dirt. But treat it right, guide it steady, feed it responsibility instead of greed. Then it'll carry you farther than your own two legs is good. Jonas made that horse work for him, and he did it without spurs or whips, just a firm hand, patience, and clear direction. The cowboy paused, his gaze drifting far past the tree line, and though he was seeing that sawmill again, gears churning and saw blades singing. When I think on Jonas' life, I don't just see a man who built wealth, I see a man who built freedom. He bought his time back, bought his family's security, bought his neighbor's opportunity. That's what real wealth does. It don't trap you under its weight, it frees you to live with purpose. Too many men these days, they pile up riches only to find themselves chained tighter than in, fearing every loss, guarding every coin like a dragon over a hoard. Jonas, he wasn't a prisoner to his fortune, he was its master, and because of that, he lived lighter than most men who will walk this earth. The cowboy leaned forward again, his hat brim throwing a shadow across his weather-eared face, and let me tell you, that's why his story matters. But ain't talking about him fella who hit a lucky strike in the hills, or a gambad who stumbled into fortune on a riverboat. We're talking about a man who built his riches board by board, nail by nail, decision by decision. He didn't wait for fate to hand him a miracle. He made his own luck by standing tall, working honest, and seeing opportunities where others only saw ruins. That mill of his wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of what's possible when a man refuses to give in to despair, when he refuses to accept the easy lie that circumstances can't be changed. The fire popped, a log splitting in half, glowing bright orange at the coal. The cowboy watched it for a long moment before speaking again. If you listen real close, you'll hear Jonas' lesson riding on the wind even now. It ain't just about money. It's about how you carry yourself when the chips are down. It's about choosing to believe in your own two hands when the world says you ain't got a chance. It's about remembering that wealth, true wealth, ain't something you measure in what you've taken, but in what you've given back and what you've built up for others. That the kind of wealth that can't be stolen, can't be taxed, can't be burned away.
And it's stitched into the lives you touched, and it keeps singing long after you've gone to dust.
The cowboy finally leaned back, the weight of his tail hanging heavy but warm, like a blanket pulled over weary shoulders. His voice lowered to a near whisper, the kind that makes you lean in close to catch every word. So if you find yourself wondering how to grow rich, don't chase the glitter or the quick fix. Do it Jonas way, slow, steady, honest, and generous. Build something worth remembering. Let your wealth be a light in dark times, a fire that keeps others warm when winter bears down hard. That's the only kind of fortune that lasts, the only kind that matters. When your story told around a campfire years from now, let it be said you lived not for the gold, but for the good it could do. The silence stretched, broken only by the sigh of the wind and the steady crackle of dying flames. The cowboy eyes softened, as though he'd laid down a truth heavier than any saddle. That all there is to it. Partner, he said at last, and that more than enough. The embers glowed low, casting a soft orange light that flickered across the cowboy face, his words carrying the weight of lived truth more than polished wisdom. Now Jonas' fortune wasn't written in ledgers alone, nor counted in coins stacked high. His wealth was a river that flowed through the valley, nurturing every patch of land it had. You could see it in the barns that stood taller because he lent timber without asking payment till the harvest was good. You could hear it in the laughter of children who got new boots because Jonas slipped them into their father's hands with a quiet nod. And you could feel it in the steadiness of men who, when trouble came knocking, knew there was someone in town they could count on. The cowboy shifted, leaning an elbow on his knee, gazing deep into the coals as though the fire itself held Jonas' ghost. It weren't that Jonas was trying to play savior. No, sir, he wasn't fixing to be the richest nor the most admired. He just believed money was like seeds. You scatter it wide and tend it with care, and before long the whole field is green. But if you lock it away, guard it selfish, it rots before it ever sees the sun. Too many men then and now, they cling to their coins like a drowning man to driftwood, not realizing the weight of that gold will only pull them under. Jonas let his money breathe, let it move, work, grow, and circle back stronger each time. A faint smile tugged the corners of the cowboy mouth, though it carried sorrow too. I remember an old aunt who once said Jonas was the only man who would turn a loan into a blessing. See, when he lent money, he didn't pile on interest or shame a man for struggling. He'd look him in the eye and say, "You'll pay me when you're standing taller." And somehow that faith worked like a miracle. Men repaid him not cause they had to, but because they wanted to. They wanted to honor the trust Jonas had put in him. And let me tell you, trust is worth more than any banknote ain't printed. It binds a community tighter than rope. The fire cracked, scattering sparks skyward, and the cowboy lifted his chin, looking out into the dark beyond the glow. There's something to learn there, partner. The world tells us wealth is a way of taking. Take more hours, take more risk, take from others before they take from you. But Jonas, he turned the gain upside down. He proved that real prosperity comes from giving. From planting seeds in soil you may never walk upon yourself. From leaving shade trees for the next generation to rest under. That legacy. Let a man ride in his story in deeds instead of stone. The cowboy voice dropped into a slow rhythm, felt the sway of a saddle on a long trail, and that story didn't end at the sawmill, nor in the valley. His way of living stretched out ripple after ripple. Young men who worked under him grew to start businesses of their own, but they carried Jonas' ways within fair pay, honest dealings, generosity when times turned lean. Families he helped raise barns for went on to help others when the floods came a few years later. One man wealth, multiplied in kindness, turned into a chain of good deeds that outlasted every storm. The cowboy tilted his hat back, the firelight catching lines on his face carved by years and windswept miles. Now, don't mistake me, Jonas still had his riches. He had land enough to ride all day and still not hit a fence, a house filled with warmth and the smell of fresh bread, and a bank account that never saw the bottom. But those things weren't the core of his fortune. No, his true riches were the hands that shook his in gratitude, the eyes that lit up when he walked into town, the prayers whispered for him by folks he never even knew he'd helped. Tell me what greater treasure could a man leave behind than the valley full of hearts stronger, 'cause he lived among them. A hush lingered, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the smell of pine and smoke. The cowboy leaned back slow, his voice barely above the murmur of the night. So, when you're out there chasing wealth, remember, Jonas, remember that gold don't shine near, red bright, a good deed carried forward. Remember that the richest soil is made from years of giving, not grabbing. When your day comes, may folks gather round a fire at this one. Speak your name with the same respect and say you built more than a fortune. You built a life worth remembering. The fire settled lower, the coals humming like a heartbeat. The cowboy let the silence settle thick, like the final note of a hymn. Before drawing one last truth, wealth ain't the end of the trail, partner. It's just the horse that carries you there. What matters is when you ride it and what you leave along the path for others to find. The night deepened and the cowboy let out a breath slower, the wind through canyon walls, the kind that carried memory in its drift. Jonas, he never set out to write sermons or lectures on money, but every step he took was a lesson writ plain. Folks saw him ride into town, not dressed in finery, but with boots dusty from working the land. That told them right away wealth wasn't about polish, it was about substance. He wasn't afraid to sweat, wasn't above lending his back to a neighbor plow or swinging a hammer when hands were short. That humility was part of his fortune, though you couldn't measure it in coins. The cowboy stirred the fire with a stick, embers leaping like tiny stars before fading into the night. They're a kind of wealth that don't show up on bank ledgers. It's the strength in a man's word, the trust that builds over years, the quiet comfort folks feel knowing you'll be there when trouble blows in. Jonas carried that wealth like a lantern in the dark, and wherever he went, shadows scattered. You could see it in the way townsfolk smiled when they spotted him riding over the ridge. You could hear it in the tone of their voices, softer, steadier, when he gave them counsel. Money may have been the seed, but character, that was the rain that made everything grow. The cowboy leaned back, letting the brim of his hat shadow his eyes. What made Jonas different was his refusal to see wealth. It's his alone. Most men, when they strike it rich, start building fences higher, pulling their coins closer, counting every grain of wheat with suspicion. But Jonas, he built gates instead of walls. He opened doors wider, not tighter. I've understood that prosperity, its fire, only thrives when shared. You keep it locked away, it smothers itself, but you set it loose under watchful hands and it warms everyone who gathers near. The flames danced, licking at the logs with a hiss, and the cowboy voice dropped to a near whisper, if speaking directly into the marrow of the listener. You see, it wasn't about charity for Jonas. Charity can sometimes make a man feel smaller, make him feel like he's taking scraps. No, Jonas gave in a way that preserved dignity. He didn't hand a man a loaf of bread. He offered him the oven to bake his own. He didn't dole out coins. He showed him how to keep the soil fertile so crops would yield for years. That diet of generosity don't just ease hunger for a night. It teaches a man to feed generations. A gust of cold air stirred the campfire smoke, carrying it high into the dark. The cowboy followed it with his eyes, then shook his head with a small smile and ended the part most overlooked. Jonas wasn't without failure. He lost shipments to floods, saw partnerships crumble, even faced betrayals from men he trusted. But instead of letting bitterness rot his heart, he planted those failures like seeds. He'd say, every loss carries a lesson. Harvest it, and you'll never starve. While other men cursed their luck, Jonas bent down and studied the soil, figuring how to grow something stronger next season. That grit, that refusal to waste even sorrow, was the steel in his backbone. The cowboy paused, rubbing his thumb against the calloused edge of his palm. I reckon that why his story lasts. Money spends, buildings crumble, even barns fall in storms. But the way a man faces failure, that's what etches his name into memory. Jonas' fortune wasn't measured in the weight of his gold, but in how he carried his burdens, lightly with hope, firmly with resolve, yet always with the eye toward helping others rise. The fire crackled louder, as though agreeing, and the cowboy let the sound linger before speaking again. Think on this, partner. What good is wealth if it don't outlive you? What ode are coins that turn to dust when your hands are gone? Jonas left behind more than money. He left behind habits, examples, traditions. He turned neighbors into kin, and kin into communities. That wealth that don't die, it just changes hands, growing stronger with each pass. The cowboy leaned forward, his shadow stretching long against the ground. If there any trail worth following, it's that one. Not the trail of greed nor the chase for trophies, but the steady path where each step leaves something good behind. A footprint in the soil, a seed in the earth, a memory in a neighbor heart. That, my friend, is the way Jonas rode, and it a path still open for any soul willing to ride it. The night grew quieter, save for the sigh of the wind through the trees. The cowboy voice softened, the closing of a hymn. So when you saddle up tomorrow and face the long ride of life, carry with you the truth Jonas lived. Money a tool, not a treasure. Its worth comes not from what you keep, but from what you build, share, and leave behind. Yet if you ride that trail true, maybe one day, long after your fire gone cold, someone will sit by their own fire telling your story with the same reverence, that the kind of fortune no storm can take. The cowboy let the silence reclaim the night, embers glowing steady, as though the fire itself was holding the memory of Jonas close. The cowboy let the fire die down to a low glow, the kind that makes shadows stretch long and quiet, like memories themselves. His voice carried softer now, like a man speaking straight to the heart. Not just the ears. Jonas always said a man true wealth wasn't in how many acres he owned or how high his barns reached. It was in the peace he carried when laying his head down at night. I believed wealth was sleeping sound, knowing you hadn't robbed no one, knowing the folks around you felt steadier because you'd passed through their lives. The cowboy brushed a hand through the dust at his side, watching it scatter and drift on the night wind. There a danger in letting gold twist your soul. He'd seen it plenty. Neighbors turning hard, greedy, even cutthroat when fortunes came fast. Jonas, though, had the patience of the soil. He knew true gains came slow, like rivers carving canyon bit by bit. Quick wealth burns hot and short, like a flash fire in the prairie, but steady wealth, built with patience and kindness, that the fire that keeps on burning, passing its warmth to the next hand. He tilted his head, as if listening to voices only the night could carry. I reckon Jonas' strength was in seeing beyond himself. Where most men looked at a coin and thought of what they could buy, Jonas thought of what it could build. He asked not, what can I get, but what can I leave? That tide of thinking changed not just his fortunes, but the fortunes of everyone who crossed his path. He turned towns into havoc, work into purpose, and hardships into lessons. That right there is a richness no man can steal. The cowboy hand settled on his knee, fingers drumming out a slow rhythm, like hooves hitting dirt on a long ride, and he never once thought himself perfect. Jonas was plain about his failings, times he doubted, times he stumbled, times when storms nearly broke him. But instead of hiding them, he shared them, taught others what he learned the hard way. He believed mistakes weren't marks of shame, but guideposts to keep the next traveler steady. That honesty gave him a kind of strength folks couldn't help but respect. In a world full of men trying to look flawless, Jonas shone brighter by being real. The night deepened, stars spilling across the sky that spilled silver, endless and quiet. Now, if folks chase comfort, thinking it'll bring happiness, they buy finer clothes, fancier meals, softer pillows. But Jonas taught something different. Comfort comes not from what surrounds you, but from what rests inside. If your heart restless, no feather bed'll fix it. But if your heart's steady, even the bare ground feels like home. That the wealth Jonas mastered, the kind that no drought, no thief, no passage of time could steal. The cowboy gaze lifted toward the heavens, eyes reflecting the glow of the embers. So may that the lesson you're meant to carry tonight, friend. Wealth ain't about chasing shinier things. It's about cultivating a spirit so calm, so generous, so rooted that no storm can unseat it. Building a legacy of light, so when your trail ends and your fire fades, others can still walk steady by the glow you left behind. A hush fell, broken on by the gentle hiss of a log and a way to act. The cowboy leaned back, excellent like a man letting go of years. That's why we still talk about Jonas by firelight. Not cause of the coins he left nor the land he tilled, but cause his way of living keeps teaching long after he gone. He proved that the richest man ain't the one with the fullest pockets, but the one whose spirit lingers stronger than the gave. The fire dwindled to coals, their glow faint but steady at the memory of a life well lived. The cowboy tipped his hat low, though bowing to the story itself. And maybe one day folks will speak your name in the same way by firesides, under starlight with gratitude in their voices. If you carry yourself like Jonas, with patience, honesty, and generosity, then your fortune won't just be tallied in coins. It'll be tallied in the lives you touched, the hope you sparked, the peace you left behind. The wind whispered through the trees, gathering the story up into its folds, carried it onward. It all good lessons meant to last. The cowboy sat quiet a long spell, letting the night soak through his bones until finally he cleared his throat low, steady like the rumble of thunder far off on the plains. There's something mighty peculiar about how true wealth shows itself. Folks expect it to come crashing down like a storm, with noise and flash. But more often than not, it slips in quiet, same at dawn creeping over the ridges. That was Jonas' way. He never chased after riches like a desperate prospector. He simply tended to what he had, kept his word, and moved steady. Before long, wealth found him, drawn to his discipline like bees to wildflowers. He leaned forward, poking at the embers with a stick, sparks darting skyward like wandering souls. I seen men counting their dollars till their eyes turned red, clutching their ledgers tighter than a mother cradling her child. They guarded every cent like it was breath itself, but still they lay awake nights, haunted by fear of losing it. And Jonas, though, he never fretted that way. He'd say, if what you hold owns your peace, you don't own a thing at all. That type of talk might have sounded simple, but it cut to the heart. Wealth to Jonas was measured in freedom, not in figures. And freedom, some few men take the time to reckon right. The cowboy eyes narrowed, star reflections catching like lanterns in the dark. Now don't mistake me, Jonas was not careless. Worked hard, studied harder, and made certain his crops and trades lined up to carry him through lean years. But he never let the numbers choke out his purpose. Every coin had to serve a reason beyond itself. Building tools, mending roofs, feeding a neighbor down on his luck. That's how his gold traveled, always in motion, always gaining value not just in the pockets but in the lives it touched. That the kind of arithmetic you won't find in any banker book. He chuckled low, deep. A sound dog gravel sliding down a slope. Funny thing about Jonas, when he passed through town, folks didn't line up to ask for loans or handouts. They asked for advice. His counsel was worth more than gold, 'cause it was carved from experience. He'd look a man straight in the eye, hear his troubles, and give him not just the truth, but the kind that built courage instead of shame. That gift of speaking straight without cutting a man down, that was wealth, too. It built something no coin could buy, trust. The cowboy hat brim shadowed his face, but his voice carried strong, and in the thing about trust, once a man earns it, it multiplies faster than any crop. Jonas understood that. He never bartered his word, never sold his honesty for quick gain. That's why, when times turned lean, doors opened for him with others found only silence. It wasn't luck, it wasn't charity.
We both depend on service and believe to every deal, every handshake, every promise.
That the kind of legacy that outlives a man leaned back slow, the firelight painting the lines of his weather-ever face. You take a lesson from that, friend. The chase for wealth may seem like a sprint, but it's a trail ride across country you've never seen. You'll meet storms, rough trails, broken bridges. If you spend in your grit chasing the horizon, you'll wear yourself out before you reach it. But if you pace yourself, tend to your companions, and leave each camp better than you found it, you'll discover the journey was the true treasure. Jonas knew that. He lived it to the day he laid down his burdens. The cowboy tapped his boot heel in the dirt, marking a rhythm to keep the word steady. Someday, when your fire burns low and your story nears its end, you'll see clear. The true measure of your wealth won't be the barns you filled nor the ledgers you kept. It'll be the laughter of kin, the gratitude of neighbors, and the peace you carry knowing you lived honest. That the inheritance Jonas left behind, and it shines brighter than any coin under starlight. The fire hissed, wood collapsing into glowing coals, the warmth drifting out steady, patient, quiet. But it carried like a prayer into the dark, hold fast to that truth, and you'll never lose your way. For when a man tends his wealth with kindness and honor, he ain't just rich in life, he rich in spirit. And that, friend, is the kind of fortune no thief, no time, no babe can take. Leonard. The night deepened, but the glow lingered, like the memory of a story meant to guide long after the teller voice was gone. The fire had burned down low, just a bed of coals with a few stubborn tongues of flame flickering here and there. But the cowboy voice held steady, deep and sure, like the hum of the earth itself. I recollect one winter, he began, when Jonas faced what most would call ruin. A flood came sudden out of the mountains, wiped near everything he built in the valley, clean off the land. Barns toppled, fences gone, crops drowned in mud. Neighbors whispered that he was finished, that no man could come back from losing so much so fast. But Jonas, he just stood out in the wreckage, boots sunk deep in the muck, staring at what was left. And instead of despair, he saw soil made rich, fresh, ready for planting. While others mourned loss, he planned new beginnings. That the kind of eye a wealthy man carries. Not one that sees only what gone, but one that spots what waiting to rise his spat into the fire, the hiss sharp and the quiet. Now, most fellas would run to borrowing, leaning heavy on banks of creditors, but not Jonas. He turned his hand to barter and skill for seed. He mended harnesses, built wagons, sharpened plows. Every hour he traded brought back what gold couldn't. And little by little, with soil dark and fertile from the flood, his fields grew fuller than before. By the time the next harvest came, he wasn't just recovered, he was ahead. Folks scratched their heads, wondering how he'd managed it. But Jonas just smiled and said, "The land don't pity a man, and neither does life." But both will reward him if he got the grit to start again. That was his sermon, and by thunder, it was true. The cowboy shifted, drawing his coat tighter against the chill. What set Jonas apart wasn't that he never stumbled. It was that he never let falling end his trail. Failures came and went, but he walked through them as though they were just rivers to ford, not walls to stop him. And in doing so, he learned something most never do. That wealth ain't about avoiding storms, but about knowing how to ride them out. Every downfall carved wisdom into him, and that wisdom grew into a fortune larger than any fire by other regard the snell. It leaned Hosanna, Molyo called over to me. A lot when the star where he's landing the night itself leaned closer to listen. There was a time when traders from the city came sniffing around, eager to buy his land cheap after a drought. They flashed contracts thick with legal tongues, hoping to scare him into signing. But Jonas, he read slow, steady, and he read true. He asked questions that cut through their clever words like a knife through rawhide. When they saw he wasn't fooled, they tried sweetening the pot with talk of quick wealth. Jonas just laughed. "Boys," he said, "you think I'm selling dirt, but what I got here ain't dirt. At time it's sweated roots. You can't buy that with ink and promises." And with that, he sent him packing. That land stayed his, and years later, it yielded more than any city man could have dreamed. He taught to it right there. Wealth worth keeping never cans from shortcuts. It cut from reft, fov, and to cheapen what you bled for. He leaned back, watching the stars wheel overhead. But maybe the richest thing Jonas owned was his way with people. He didn't treat a hired hand and a tool, nor a neighbor or competition. To him, every man had a place. Every woman had wisdom worth listening to. Every child had a spark waiting to be kindled. Built trust in small ways, splitting firewood for widows, repairing wagons without charge, sitting with the sick through long nights. Some would say he wasted time, but those seeds of kindness bore the heaviest harvest. Years later, when he needed men to raise a barn after lightning struck it down, a whole town showed up, working without asking a dime. That, my friend, is wealth. To stand on your land and see a crowd come, not 'cause they're paid, but 'cause they believe in you, that riches few kings attaste. The cowboy eyes softened. He stared into the glowing coals. Jonas showed me something else too, that wealth ain't just about gathering, it about letting go at the right time. He never clung too tight to coin, nor hoarded his possessions like a miser. When his children grew, he passed last to them, not at an inheritance to squander, but a responsibility to steward. He'd walk them down the fields, placing their hands in the soil, saying, "This ain't yours to own, it's yours to tend. If you care for it, it'll care for you." That lesson, he reckoned, was more valuable than any deed or title. And sure enough, his children prospered, not because of what he gave, but because of what he taught them to build. The cowboy paused, drawing a slow breath, his voice coming rough with memory. I reckon the true story of Jonas is this: when he finally laid down, old and worn, he didn't leave behind vaults of gold nor accounts in far-off banks. He left behind a town stronger than when he found it, children wiser than when he raised them, and neighbors who spoke his name with gratitude instead of envy. And when the preacher asked what to put on his headstone, the folks all answered the same: "Here lies a man who left us richer, though he took nothing with him." That was Jonas. That was his fortune. The cowboy tipped his hat low, shadows hiding the emotion writ clear in his features. So if you're wondering where to look for wealth, don't look in vaults nor in mines. Look in the work of your hands, the strength of your word, the trust of your kin, and the peace in your heart. Tend those things, and you'll never be poor. Ignore them, and no matter how heavy your purse, you'll always be beggar. The fire cracked one last time, embers risen like spirits to the heavens, and the cowboy tale lingered in the night air, heavy with truth and quiet with peace. The cowboy shifted in his seat, boots scuffing the dirt till the firelight licked across his weather-redder face. "I reckon I ought to tell you one more story," he muttered, voice low but steady, like the sound of a slow river moving through canyon walls. "This one ain't about riches piled high in vaults, nor about luck coming to a man by chance. It about a fellow named Abram who built his fortune the way a blacksmith builds a blade, slow heat, steady hammering, and patience enough to wait till the steel shines." He leaned forward, eyes catching the glow of the embers. Abram started with near nothing but a mule and a rickety wagon. His first trade was hauling timber for whoever'd pay him 2 coins and a meal. Long days, blistered hands, and not a lick of luxury. Most men would curse their lot, said the world owed them better. But Abram, he saw them callous as investments. Every splinter in his palm was proof he was buying his way out of poverty. Not with money, but with grit. He used them first served, not on comfort, but on sharpening his tools, strengthening his wagon, and buying better harness for his mule. Each choice, small though it seemed, built the road to something greater. The cowboy voice took on a rhythm, words coming like hoofbeats on packed dirt. Now Abram had a way of watching folks. Where others saw empty land, he saw pathways of trade. Where others saw strangers, he saw partners waiting to be made. One winter, when snow near shut the town off from the world, he hauled flour and salt through drifts higher than his mule belly. He didn't price it greedy neither. He sold fair, made enough to cover his risks, and earned something more precious than coin, the trust of every family in that valley. Come spring, when trade roads opened again, guess who folks called first? Not the merchants from the city, but Abram. And with that trust, he built his business wider than the rivers run. The cowboy spat into the fire, the hiss sharp against the quiet, Abram never gambled his earnings on quick schemes. He didn't waste it on shiny trinkets nor on drink that dulled the mind. Instead, he learned to lend. A neighbor short on seed, Abram loaned him the coin or the grain itself, asking back not that payment, but a share in the harvest. That way, his fortune grew alongside his neighbor. He figured it was better to build a chain of strong men mend him than to sit atop a pile of silver alone. And sure enough, when hard times came, them same neighbors pulled him through storms he couldn't weather alone. That the sort of wealth that don't show on ledgers but proves its weight when the winds howl. The cowboy tone softened, carrying a kind of reverence. What set Abram apart was how he treated failure. For him, a failed deal wasn't the end, it was tuition. He paid with mistakes but always left with lessons. Once, he sunk money into a caravan that never made it past the mountains, lost near every dollar he'd put down. But instead of wallowing, he rode out, talked to the men who tried and failed, learned why the trail ate him alive. Next year, he planned his own route, safer though longer, and made back twice what he'd lost. That's the secret. Son, wealth don't come from avoiding mistakes. It cuts from refusing. To waste 'em, he reached for a stick, stirring the coals, sparks rising like stars. As years rolled on, Abram's name became a promise. Merchants would say, if Abram vouched it, it's solid. His credit stretched further than his coin they could, and his word carried weight no bank could match. You see, coin can be stolen, land can wash away, but reputation, once you forge it true, becomes the kind of currency that grows stronger the more it's spent. Abram guarded his name like treasure, never raking a deal, never speaking false. That right there was his sharpest tool. The cowboy leaned back, eyes far off, as though seeing the man himself in the flames. When Abram passed on, he didn't leave behind a chest of jewels nor a mansion to all the world. What he left was a map of trust, drawn across every life he touched. Men remembered him not for how much he owned, but for how many he lifted. And though his bones rested quiet in the earth, his name kept working, like a hammer swinging, long after the smith arm grows still. His sons, his daughters, his partners, they carried on, richer in wisdom than in gold. And that, the cowboy said with final low, is the truest kind of wealth a man can leave. The fireside, throwing shadows tall against the trees. The cowboy drew his hat low, his voice turning into little more than a murmur. So don't chase wealth like a gambad chases dice. Build it steady, fair, and true, and it'll outlast your days. Abram proved that. And if you're listening close, maybe you'll prove it too.